The Scarecrow of Oz by L. Frank Baum, narrated by Sam Kusi. Chapter 1. The Great Whirlpool. "Seems to me," said Cap'n Bill as he sat beside Trot under the big acacia tree, looking out over the blue ocean, "seems to me, Trot, as how the more we know, the more we find we don't know." "I can't quite make that out, Cap'n Bill," answered the little girl in a serious voice, after a moment's thought, during which her eyes followed those of the old sailor man across the glassy surface of the sea. "Seems to me that all we learn is just so much gained." "I know, it looks that way at first," said the sailor, nodding his head, "but those as knows the least have a habit of thinking they know all there is to know, while them as knows the most admits what a terrible big world this is. It's the knowing ones that realize one lifetime ain't long enough to get more than a few dips of the oars of knowledge." Trot didn't answer. She was a very little girl, with big, solemn eyes and an earnest, simple manner. Cap'n Bill had been her faithful companion for years, and had taught her almost everything she knew. He was a wonderful man, this Cap'n Bill. Not so very old, although his hair was grizzled, what there was of it. Most of his head was bald as an egg, and as shiny as oilcloth, and this made his big ears stick out in a funny way. His eyes had a gentle look, and were pale blue in colour, and his round face was rugged and bronzed. Cap'n Bill's left leg was missing, from the knee down, and that was why the sailor no longer sailed the seas. The wooden leg he wore was good enough to stump around with on land, or even to take Trot out for a row or a sail on the ocean. But when it came to running up aloft, or performing active duties on shipboard, the old sailor was not equal to the task. The loss of his leg had ruined his career, and the old sailor found comfort in devoting himself to the education and companionship of the little girl. The accident to Cap'n Bill's leg was bad, and happened at about the time Trot was born, and ever since that he had lived with Trot's mother as a starboarder, having enough money saved up to pay for his weekly keep. He loved the baby, and often held her on his lap. Her first ride was on Cap'n Bill's shoulders, for she had no baby carriage, and when she began to toddle around, the child and the sailor became close comrades and enjoyed many strange adventures together. It is said the fairies had been present at Trot's birth, and had marked her forehead with their invisible mystic signs, so that she was able to see and do many wonderful things. The acacia tree was on top of a high bluff, but a path ran down the bank in a zigzag way to the water's edge, where Cap'n Bill's boat was moored to a rock by means of a stout cable. It had been a hot, sultry afternoon, with scarcely a breath of air stirring, so Cap'n Bill and Trot had been quietly sitting beneath the shade of the tree, waiting for the sun to get low enough for them to take a row. They had decided to visit one of the great caves which the waves had washed out of the rocky coast during many years of steady effort. The caves were a source of continual delight to both the girl and the sailor, who loved to explore their awesome depths. "I believe, Captain," remarked Trot at last, "that it's time for us to start." The old man cast a shrewd glance at the sky, the sea, and the motionless boat. Then he shook his head. "Maybe it's time, Trot," he answered, "but I don't just like the looks of things this afternoon." "What's wrong?" she asked wonderingly. "Can't say as to that. Things is too quiet to suit me, that's all. No breeze, not a ripple atop the water, nary a gull a-flying anywhere, and the end of the hottest day of the year. I ain't no weather prophet, Trot, but any sailor would know The signs is ominous. "There's nothing wrong that I can see," said Trot. "If there was a cloud in the sky, even as big as my thumb, we might worry about it, but look, Captain, the sky is as clear as can be." He looked again and nodded. "Perhaps we can make a cave, all right," he agreed, not wishing to disappoint her. "It's only a little way out, and we'll be on the watch, so come along, Trot." Together they descended the winding path to the beach. It was no trouble for the girl to keep her footing on the steep way, but Cap'n Bill, because of his wooden leg, had to hold on to rocks and roots now and then to save himself from tumbling. On a level path he was as spry as anyone, but to climb uphill or down required some care. They reached the boat safely, and while Trot was untying the rope, Cap'n Bill reached into the crevice of the rock and drew out several tallow candles and a box of wax matches, which he thrust into the capacious pockets of his sou'wester. This sou'wester was a short coat of oilskin, which the old sailor wore on all occasions, when he wore a coat at all, and the pockets always contained a variety of objects, useful and ornamental, which made even Trot wonder where they all came from and why Cap'n Bill should treasure them. The jackknives, a big one and a little one, the bits of cord, the fish hooks, the nails, these were handy to have on certain occasions. But bits of shell and tin boxes with unknown contents, buttons, pincers, bottles of curious stones and the like, seemed quite unnecessary to carry around. That was Cap'n Bill's business, however, and now that he added the candles and the matches to his collection, Trot made no comment, for she knew these last were to light their way through the caves. The sailor always rowed the boat, for he handled the oars with strength and skill. Trot sat in the stern and steered. The place where they embarked was a little bright or circular bay, and the boats cut across a much larger bay toward a distant headland where the caves were located, right at the water's edge. They were nearly a mile from shore, and about halfway across the bay, when Trot suddenly sat up straight and exclaimed, "What's that, Captain?" He stopped rowing and turned half around to look. "That, Trot," he slowly replied, "looks to me mighty like a whirlpool." "What makes it, Captain?" "A whirl in the air makes the whirl in the water. I was afraid as we'd met with trouble, Trot. Things didn't look right. The air was too still." "It's coming closer," said the girl. The old man grabbed the oars and began rowing with all his strength. "'Tain't coming closer to us, Trot," he gasped. "It's we that are coming closer to the whirlpool. The thing is drawing us to it like a magnet." Trot's sun-bronzed face was a little paler as she grasped the tiller firmly and tried to steer the boat away, but she said not a word to indicate fear. The swirl of the water as they came nearer made a roaring sound that was fearful to listen to. So fierce and powerful was the whirlpool that it drew the surface of the sea into the form of a great basin, slanting downward toward the center, where a big hole had been made in the ocean, a hole with walls of water that were kept in place by the rapid whirling of the air. The boat in which Trot and Cap'n Bill were riding was just on the outer edge of this saucer-like slant, and the old sailor knew very well that, unless he could quickly force the little craft away from the rushing current, they would soon be drawn into the great black hole that yawned in the middle. So he exerted all his might and pulled as he had never pulled before. He pulled so hard that the left oar snapped in two and sent Cap'n Bill sprawling upon the bottom of the boat. He scrambled up quickly enough and glanced over the side. Then he looked at Trot, who sat quite still with a serious face, a faraway look in her sweet eyes. The boat was now speeding swiftly of its own accord, following the line of the circular basin round and round, and gradually drawing nearer to the great hole in the centre. Any further effort to escape the whirlpool was useless, and realizing this fact, Cap'n Bill turned toward Trot and put an arm around her, as if to shield her from the awful fate before them. He did not try to speak because the roar of the waters would have drowned the sound of his voice. These two faithful comrades had faced dangers before, but nothing to equal that which now faced them. Yet Cap'n Bill, noting the look in Trot's eyes, and remembering how often she had been protected by unseen powers, did not quite give way to despair. The great hole in the dark water, now growing nearer and nearer, looked very terrifying. But they were both brave enough to face it and await the result of the adventure. Chapter 2. The Cavern Under the Sea. The circles were so much smaller at the bottom of the basin, and the boat moved so much more swiftly, that Trot was beginning to get dizzy with the motion, when suddenly the boat made a leap and dived headlong into the murky depths of the hole. Whirling like tops, but still clinging together, the sailor and the girl were separated from their boat and plunged down, 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 into the farthest most recesses of the great ocean. At first their fall was swift as an arrow, but presently they seemed to be going more moderately, and Trot was almost sure that unseen arms were about her, supporting her and protecting her. She could see nothing because the water filled her eyes and blurred her vision, but she clung fast to Cap'n Bill's sou'wester, while other arms clung fast to her, and so they gradually sank down and down until a full stop was made, when they began to ascend again. But it seemed to Trot that they were not rising straight to the surface from where they had come. The water was no longer whirling them, and they seemed to be drawn in a slanting direction through still, cool ocean depths. And then, in much quicker time than I have told it, up they popped to the surface and were cast at full length upon a sandy beach, where they lay choking and gasping for breath and wondering what had happened to them. Trot was the first to recover. Disengaging herself from Cap'n Bill's wet embrace and sitting up, she rubbed the water from her eyes and then looked around her. A soft, bluish-green glow lighted the place, which seemed to be a sort of cavern, for above and on either side of her were rugged rocks. They had been cast upon a beach of clear sand, which slanted upward from the pool of water at their feet, a pool which doubtless led into the big ocean that fed it. Above the reach of the waves of the pool were more rocks, and still more and more, into the dim windings and recesses of which the glowing light from the water did not penetrate. The place looked grim and lonely, but Trot was thankful that she was still alive and had suffered no severe injury during her trying adventure underwater. At her side, Cap'n Bill was sputtering and coughing, trying to get rid of the water he had swallowed. Both of them were soaked through, yet the cavern was warm and comfortable, and the wetting did not dismay the little girl in the least. She crawled up the slant of sand and gathered in her hand a bunch of dried seaweed, with which she mopped the face of Cap'n Bill and cleared the water from his eyes and ears. Presently, the old man sat up and stared at her intently. Then he nodded his bald head 3 times and said in a gurgling voice, "Mighty good, Trot, mighty good. We didn't reach Davy Jones's locker that time, did we? Though why we didn't and why we're here is more than I can make out." "Take it easy, Captain," she replied. "We're safe enough, I guess, at least for the time being." He squeezed the water out of the bottom of his loose trousers and felt of his wooden leg and arms and head, and finding he had brought all of his person with him, he gathered courage to examine closely their surroundings. "Where do you think we are, Trot?" he presently asked. "Can't say, Captain. Perhaps in one of our caves." He shook his head. "No," said he, "I don't think that at all. The distance we came up didn't seem half as far as the distance we went down, and you'll notice there ain't any outside entrance to this cavern whatever. It's a regular dome over the pool of water, and unless there's some passage at the back, up yonder, we're fast prisoners." Trot looked thoughtfully over her shoulder. "When we're rested," she said, "we will crawl up there and see if there's a way to get out." Cap'n Bill reached in the pocket of his oilskin coat and took out his pipe. It was still dry, for he kept it in an oilskin pouch with his tobacco. His matches were in a tight tin box, so, in a few moments, the old sailor was smoking contentedly. Trot knew it helped him to think when he was in any difficulty. Also, the pipe did much to restore the old sailor's composure. After his long ducking and his terrible fright, a fright that was more on Trot's account than his own. The sand was dry where they sat, and soaked up the water that dripped from their clothing. When Trot had squeezed the wet out of her hair, she began to feel much like her old self again. By and by they got upon their feet and crept up the incline to the scattered boulders above. Some of these were of huge size, but by passing between some and around others, they were able to reach the extreme rear of the cavern. "Yes," said Trot with interest, "here's a round hole, and it's black as night inside it," remarked Cap'n Bill. "Just the same," answered the girl, "we ought to explore it and see where it goes, 'cause it's the only possible way we can get out of this place." Cap'n Bill eyed the hole doubtfully. "It may be a way out of here, Trot," he said, "but it may be a way into a far worse place than this. I'm not sure, but our best plan is to stay right here." Trot wasn't sure either, when she thought of it in that light. After a while she made her way back to the sands again, and Cap'n Bill followed her. As they sat down, the child looked thoughtfully at the sailor's bulging pockets. "How much food have we got, Captain?" she asked. "Half a dozen ship's biscuits and a hunk of cheese," he replied. "Want some now, Trot?" She shook her head, saying, "That ought to keep us alive about 3 days if we're careful of it." "Longer than that, Trot," said Cap'n Bill, but his voice was a little troubled and unsteady. "But if we stay here, we're bound to starve in time," continued the girl, "while if we go into the dark hole—" "Some things are more hard to face than starvation," said the sailor man gravely. "We don't know what's inside that dark hole, Trot, nor where it might lead us to." "There's a way to find that out," she persisted. Instead of replying, Cap'n Bill began searching in his pockets. He soon drew out a little package of fish hooks and a long line. Trot watched him join them together. Then he crept a little way up the slope and turned over a big rock. 2 or 3 small crabs began scurrying away over the sands, and the old sailor caught them and put one on his hook and the others in his pocket. Coming back to the pool, he swung the hook over his shoulder and circled it around his head and cast it nearly into the center of the water, where he allowed it to sink gradually, paying out the line as far as it would go. When the end was reached, he began drawing it in again until the crab bait was floating on the surface. Trot watched him cast the line a second time and a third. She decided that either there were no fishes in the pool or they would not bite the crab bait. But Cap'n Bill was an old fisherman and not easily discouraged. When the crab got away, he put another on the hook. When the crabs were all gone, he climbed up the rocks and found some more. Meantime, Trot tired of watching him and lay down upon the sands, where she fell fast asleep. During the next 2 hours, her clothing dried completely, as did that of the old sailor. They were both so used to salt water that there was no danger of taking cold. Finally, the little girl was wakened by a splash beside her and a grunt of satisfaction from Cap'n Bill. She opened her eyes to find that the captain had landed a silver-scaled fish weighing about 2 pounds. This cheered her considerably, and she hurried to scrape together a heap of seaweed, while Cap'n Bill cut up the fish with his jackknife and got it ready for cooking. They had cooked fish with seaweed before. Cap'n Bill wrapped his fish in some of the weed and dipped it in the water to dampen it. Then he lighted a match and set fire to Trot's heap, which speedily burned down to a glowing bed of ashes. Then they laid the wrapped fish on the ashes, covered it with more seaweed, and allowed this to catch fire and burn to embers. After feeding the fire with seaweed for some time, the sailor finally decided that their supper was ready. So he scattered the ashes and drew out the bits of fish, still encased in their smoking wrappings. When these wrappings were removed, the fish was found thoroughly cooked, and both Trot and Cap'n Bill ate of it freely. It had a slight flavour of seaweed and would have been better with a sprinkling of salt. The soft glow which until now had lighted the cavern began to grow dim, but there was a great quantity of seaweed in the place, so after they had eaten their fish, they kept the fire alive for a time by giving it a handful of fuel now and then. From an inner pocket the sailor drew a small flask of battered metal and, unscrewing the cap, handed it to Trot. She took but one swallow of the water, although she wanted more, and she noticed that Cap'n Bill merely wet his lips with it. "S'pose," said she, staring at the glowing seaweed fire and speaking slowly, "that we can catch all the fish we need. How about drinking water, Captain?" He moved uneasily but did not reply. Both of them were thinking about the dark hole, but while Trot had little fear of it, the old man could not overcome his dislike to enter the place. He knew that Trot was right, though. To remain in the cavern where they were now could only result in slow but sure death. It was a nightmare up on the earth's surface, so the little girl became drowsy and soon fell asleep. After a time, the old sailor slumbered on the sands beside her. It was very still, and nothing disturbed them for hours. When at last they awoke, the cavern was light again. They had divided one of the biscuits and were munching it for breakfast when they were startled by a sudden splash in the pool. Looking toward it, they saw emerging from the water the most curious creature either of them had ever beheld. It wasn't a fish, Trot decided, nor was it a beast. It had wings, though, and queer wings they were, shaped like an inverted chopping bowl and covered with tough skin instead of feathers. It had 4 legs, much like the legs of a stork, only double the number, and its head was shaped a good deal like that of a pole parrot, with a beak that curved downward in front and upward at the edges, and was half bill and half mouth. But to call it a bird was out of the question because it had no feathers, except a crest of wavy plumes of a scarlet colour on the very tops of its head. The strange creature must have weighed as much as Cap'n Bill, and as it floundered and struggled to get out of the water to the sandy beach, it was so big and unusual that both Trot and her companion stared at it in wonder that was not unmixed with fear. Chapter 3. The Orc. The eyes that regarded them as the creature stood dripping before them were bright and mild in expression, and the queer addition to their party made no attempt to attack them and seemed quite as surprised by the meeting as they were. "I wonder," whispered Trot, "what it is." "Who, me?" exclaimed the creature in a shrill, high-pitched voice. "Why, I'm an orc." "Oh," said the girl. "But what is an orc?" "I am," he repeated a little proudly as he shook the water from his funny wings, "and if ever an orc was glad to be out of the water and on dry land again, you can be mighty sure that I am the especial individual orc." "Have you been in the water long?" inquired Cap'n Bill, thinking it only polite to show an interest in that strange creature. Why, this last ducking was about 10 minutes, I believe, and that's about 9 minutes and 60 seconds too long for comfort, was the reply. But last night I was in an awful pickle, I assure you. The whirlpool caught me and... Oh, were you in the whirlpool too? Asked Trot eagerly. He gave her a glance that was somewhat reproachful. I believe I was mentioning the fact, young lady, when your desire to talk interrupted me, said the orc. I am not usually careless in my actions, but that whirlpool was so busy yesterday that I thought I'd see what mischief it was up to. So I flew a little too near it, and the suction of the air drew me down into the depth of the ocean. Water and I are natural enemies, and it would have conquered me this time had not a bevy of pretty mermaids come to my assistance and dragged me away from the whirling water and far up into the cavern, where they deserted me. Why, that's about the same thing that happened to us, cried Trot. Was your cavern like this one? I haven't examined this one yet, answered the orc, but if they happen to be alike, I shudder at our fate, for the other one was a prison with no outlet except by means of the water. I stayed there all night, however, and this morning I plunged into the pool, as far down as I could go, and then swam as hard and as far as I could. The rocks scraped my back now and then, and I barely escaped the clutches of an ugly sea monster. But by and by I came to the surface to catch my breath, and found myself here. That's the whole story, and as I see you have something to eat, I entreat you to give me a share of it. The truth is, I'm half starved. With these words, the orc squatted down beside them. Very reluctantly, Cap'n Bill drew another biscuit from his pocket and held it out. The orc promptly seized it in one of its front claws and began to nibble the biscuit in much the same manner a parrot might have done. We haven't much grub, said the sailor man, but we're willing to share it with a comrade in distress. That's right, returned the orc, cocking its head sidewise in a cheerful manner, and then for a few minutes there was silence, while they all ate of the biscuits. After a while, Trot said, I've never seen or heard of an orc before. Are there many of you? We are rather few and exclusive, I believe, was the reply. In the country where I was born, we are the absolute rulers of all living things, from ants to elephants. What country is that? Asked Cap'n Bill. Auckland. Where does it lie? I don't know exactly. You see, I have a restless nature, for some reason, while all the rest of my race are quiet and contented orcs and seldom stray far from home. From childhood days I loved to fly long distances away, although father often warned me that I would get into trouble by doing so. It's a big world, Flipper, my son, he would say, and I've heard that in parts of it live queer two-legged creatures called men, who war upon all other things, and would have little respect for even an orc. This naturally aroused my curiosity, and after I had completed my education and left school, I decided to fly out into the world and try to get a glimpse of the creatures called men. So I left home without saying goodbye, an act I shall always regret. Adventures were many, I found. I sighted men several times, but have never before been so close to them as now. Also, I had to fight my way through the air, for I met gigantic birds with fluffy feathers all over them, which attacked me fiercely. Besides, it kept me busy escaping from floating airships. In my rambling, I had lost all track of distance or direction, so that when I wanted to go home, I had no idea where my country was located. I've now been trying to find it for several months, and it was during one of my flights over the ocean that I met the whirlpool and became its victim. Trot and Cap'n Bill listened to this recital with much interest, and from the friendly tone and harmless appearance of the orc, they judged he was not likely to prove so disagreeable a companion as at first they had feared he might be. The orc sat upon its haunches much as a cat does, but used the finger-like claws of its front legs almost as cleverly as if they were hands. Perhaps the most curious thing about the creature was its tail, or what ought to have been its tail. This queer arrangement of skin, bones, and muscle was shaped like the propellers used on boats and airships, having fan-like surfaces and being pivoted to its body. Cap'n Bill knew something of mechanics, and observing the propeller-like tail of the York, he said, "I suppose you're a pretty swift flyer." "Yes, indeed. The Yorks are admitted to be the kings of the air." "Your wings don't seem to amount to much," remarked Trot. "Well, they are not very big," admitted the York, waving the 4 hollow skins gently to and fro. "But they serve to support my body in the air while I speed along by means of my tail. Still, taken altogether, I'm very handsomely formed, don't you think?" Trot did not like to reply, but Cap'n Bill nodded gravely. "For an orc," said he, "you're a wonder. I've never seen one before, but I can imagine you're as good as any." That seemed to please the creature, and it began walking around the cavern, making its way easily up the slope. While it was gone, Trot and Cap'n Bill each took another sip from the water flask to wash down their breakfast. "Why, here's a hole, an exit, an outlet," exclaimed the York from above. "We know," said Trot. "We found it last night." "Well then, let's be off," continued the York, after sticking its head into the black hole and sniffing once or twice. "The air seems fresh and sweet, and it can't lead us to any worse place than this." The girl and the sailor man got up and climbed to the side of the York. "We'd about decided to explore this hole before you came," explained Cap'n Bill, "but it's a dangerous place to navigate in the dark, so wait till I light a candle." "What is a candle?" inquired the York. "You'll see in a minute," said Trot. The old sailor drew one of the candles from his right side pocket and the tin matchbox from his left side pocket. When he lighted the match, the York gave a startled jump and eyed the flame suspiciously, but Cap'n Bill proceeded to light the candle, and the action interested the York very much. "Light," it said somewhat nervously, "is valuable in a hole of this sort. The candle is not dangerous, I hope." "Sometimes it burns your fingers," answered Trot, "but that's about the worst it can do, except to blow out when you don't want it to." Cap'n Bill shielded the flame with his hand and crept into the hole. It wasn't any too big for a grown man, but after he had crawled a few feet it grew larger. Trot came close behind him, and then the York followed. "Seemed like a regular tunnel," muttered the sailor man, who was creeping along awkwardly because of his wooden leg. The rocks, too, hurt his knees. For nearly half an hour, the three moved slowly along the tunnel, which made many twists and turns and sometimes slanted downward and sometimes upward. Finally, Cap'n Bill stopped short with an exclamation of disappointment and held the flickering candle far ahead to light the scene. "What's wrong?" demanded Trot, who could see nothing because the sailor's form completely filled the hole. "Why, we've come to the end of our travels, I guess," he replied. "Is the hole blocked?" inquired the York. "No, I'm on the edge of a precipice. Wait a minute and I'll move along and let you see for yourself. Be careful, Trot, not to fall." Then he crept forward a little and moved to one side, holding the candle so that the girl could see to follow him. The York came next, and now all three knelt on a narrow ledge of rock which dropped straight away and left a huge black space which the tiny flame of the candle could not illuminate. Said the York, peering over the edge. "This doesn't look very promising, I'll admit. But let me take your candle and I'll fly down and see what's below us." "Aren't you afraid?" asked Trot. "Certainly I'm afraid," responded the York. "But if we intend to escape, we can't stay on this shelf forever. So, as I notice you poor creatures cannot fly, it is my duty to explore the place for you." Cap'n Bill handed the York the candle, which had now burned to about half its length. The York took it in one claw rather cautiously and then tipped its body forward and slipped over the edge. They heard a queer buzzing sound as the tail revolved, and a brisk flapping of the peculiar wings, but they were more interested just then in following with their eyes the tiny speck of light which marked the location of the candle. This light first made a great circle, then dropped slowly downward, and suddenly was extinguished, leaving everything before them as black as ink. "Hi there! How did that happen?" cried the Orc. "It blew out, I guess," shouted Cap'n Bill. "Fetch it here." "I can't see where you are," said the Orc. So Cap'n Bill got out another candle and lighted it, and its flame enabled the Orc to fly back to them. It alighted on the edge and held out the bit of candle. "What made it stop burning?" asked the creature. "The wind," said Trot. "You must be more careful this time." "What's the place like?" inquired Cap'n Bill. "I don't know yet, but there must be a bottom to it, so I'll try to find it." With this, the Orc started out again, and this time sank downward more slowly. Down, down, down it went, till the candle was a mere spark, and then it headed away to the left, and Trot and Cap'n Bill lost all sight of it. In a few minutes, however, they saw the spark of light again, and as the sailor still held the second lighted candle, the Orc made straight toward them. It was only a few yards distant when suddenly it dropped the candle with a cry of pain, and next moment alighted, fluttering wildly upon the rocky ledge. "What's the matter?" asked Trot. "It bit me," wailed the Orc. "I don't like your candles." The thing began to disappear slowly as soon as I took it in my claw, and it grew smaller and smaller until just now it turned and bit me, a most unfriendly thing to do. "Oh, oh, ouch, what a bite." "That's the nature of candles, I'm sorry to say," explained Cap'n Bill with a grin. "You have to handle 'em mighty careful. But tell us, what did you find down there?" "I found a way to continue our journey," said the Orc, nursing tenderly the claw which had been burned. "Just below us is a great lake of black water, which looked so cold and wicked that it made me shudder. But away at the left there's a big tunnel which we can easily walk through. I don't know where it leads to, of course, but we must follow it and find out." "Well, we can't get into it," protested the little girl. "We can't fly as you do, you must remember." "No, that's true," replied the Orc musingly. "Your bodies are built very poorly, it seems to me, since all you can do is crawl upon the earth's surface. But you may ride upon my back, and in that way I can promise you a safe journey to the tunnel." "Are you strong enough to carry us?" asked Cap'n Bill, doubtfully. "Yes, indeed, I'm strong enough to carry a dozen of you, if you could find a place to sit," was the reply. "But there's only room between my wings for one at a time, so I'll have to make 2 trips." "All right, I'll go first," decided Cap'n Bill. He lit another candle for Trot to hold while they were gone and to light the Orc on his return to her. And then the old sailor got upon the Orc's back, where he sat with his wooden leg sticking straight out sidewise. "If you start to fall, clasp your arms around my neck," advised the creature. "If I start to fall, it's good night and pleasant dreams," said Cap'n Bill. "All ready?" asked the Orc. "Start the bus tail," said Cap'n Bill with a tremble in his voice. But the Orc flew away so gently that the old man never even tottered in his seat. Trot watched the light of Cap'n Bill's candle till it disappeared in the far distance. She didn't like to be left alone on this dangerous ledge, with the lake of black water hundreds of feet below her, but she was a brave little girl and waited patiently for the return of the Orc. It came even sooner than she had expected, and the creature said to her, "Your friend is safe in the tunnel. Now then, get aboard and I'll carry you to him in a jiffy." I'm sure not many little girls would have cared to take that awful ride through the huge black cavern on the back of a skinny Orc. Trot didn't care for it herself, but it just had to be done, and so she did it as courageously as possible. Her heart beat fast, and she was so nervous she could scarcely hold the candle in her fingers as the orc sped swiftly through the darkness. It seemed like a long ride to her, yet in reality, the orc covered the distance in a wonderfully brief period of time, and soon Trot stood safely beside Cap'n Bill on the level floor of a big arched tunnel. The sailor man was very glad to greet his little comrade again, and both were grateful to the orc for his assistance. "I don't know where this tunnel leads to," remarked Cap'n Bill, "but it surely looks more promising than that other hole we crept through." "When the orc is rested," said Trot, "we'll travel on and see what happens." "Rested?" cried the orc, as scornfully as his shrill voice would allow. "That bit of flying didn't tire me out at all. I'm used to flying days at a time without ever stopping once." "Let's move on, then," proposed Cap'n Bill. He still held in his hand one lighted candle, so Trot blew out the other flame and placed her candle in the sailor's big pocket. She knew it was not wise to burn 2 candles at once. The tunnel was straight and smooth and very easy to walk through, so they made good progress. Trot thought that the tunnel began about 2 miles from the cavern where they had been cast by the whirlpool, but now it was impossible to guess the miles travelled, for they walked steadily for hours and hours, without any change in their surroundings. Finally, Cap'n Bill stopped to rest. "There's something queer about this air tunnel, I'm certain," he declared, wagging his head doubtfully. "Here's 3 candles gone already, and only 1 more left us. Yet the tunnel's the same as it was when we started, and how long it's going to keep up, no one knows." "Couldn't we walk without a light?" asked Trot. "The way seems safe enough." "It does right now," was the reply, "but we can't tell when we are likely to come to another gulf, or something just as dangerous. In that case, we'd be killed before we knew it." "Suppose I go ahead," suggested the orc. "I don't fear a fall, you know, and if anything happens, I'll call out and warn you." "That's a good idea," declared Trot, and Cap'n Bill thought so too. So the orc started off ahead, quite in the dark, and hand in hand, the 2 followed him. When they had walked in this way for a good long time, the orc halted and demanded food. Cap'n Bill had not mentioned food because there was so little left, only 3 biscuits and a lump of cheese, about as big as his 2 fingers. But he gave the orc half of a biscuit, sighing as he did so. The creature did not care for the cheese, so the sailor divided it between himself and Trot. They lighted a candle and sat down in the tunnel while they ate. "My feet hurt me," grumbled the orc. "I'm not used to walking, and this rocky passage is so uneven and lumpy that it hurts me to walk upon it." "Can't you fly along?" asked Trot. "No, the roof is too low," said the orc. After the meal, they resumed their journey, which Trot began to fear would never end. When Cap'n Bill noticed how tired the little girl was, he paused and lighted a match and looked at his big silver watch. "Why, it's night," he exclaimed. "We've trampled all day, and still, we're in this awful passage, which maybe goes straight through the middle of the world, and maybe is a circle, in which case we can keep walking till doomsday. Not knowing what's before us, so well as to know what's behind us, I propose we make a stop, now, and try to sleep till morning." "That will suit me," asserted the orc with a groan. "My feet are hurting me dreadfully, and for the last few miles I've been limping with pain." "My foot hurts too," said the sailor, looking for a smooth place on the rocky floor to sit down. "Your foot," cried the orc. "Why, you've only 1 to hurt you, while I have 4. So I suffer 4 times as much as you possibly can. Here, hold the candle while I look at the bottoms of my claws. I declare," he said, examining them by the flickering light, There are bunches of pain all over them." "Perhaps," said Trot, who was very glad to sit down beside her companions, "you've got corns." "Corns? Nonsense. Orcs never have corns," protested the creature, rubbing its sore feet tenderly. "Then maybe they're, what do you call them, Captain Bill? Something about the Pilgrim's Progress, you know?" "Bunions," said Captain Bill. "Oh yes, maybe you've got bunions." "It is possible," moaned the Orc. "But whatever they are, another day of such walking on them would drive me crazy." "I'm sure they'll feel better by morning," said Captain Bill encouragingly. "Go to sleep and try to forget your sore feet." The Orc cast a reproachful look at the sailor man, who didn't see it. Then the creature asked plaintively, "Do we eat now or do we starve?" "There's only half a biscuit left for you," answered Captain Bill. "No one knows how long we'll have to stay in this dark tunnel, where there's nothing whatever to eat. So I advise you to save that morsel of food till later." "Give it here to me now," demanded the Orc. "If I'm going to starve, I'll do it all at once, not by degrees." Captain Bill produced the biscuit and the creature ate it in a trice. Trot was rather hungry and whispered to Captain Bill that she'd take part of her share, but the old man secretly broke his own half biscuit in two, saving Trot's share for a time of greater need. He was beginning to be worried over the little girl's plight, and long after she was asleep and the Orc was snoring in a rather disagreeable manner, Captain Bill sat with his back to a rock and smoked his pipe and tried to think of some way to escape from this seemingly endless tunnel. But after a time, he also slept, for hobbling on a wooden leg all day was tiresome. And there in the dark slumbered the three adventurers for many hours, until the Orc roused itself and kicked the old sailor with one foot. "It must be another day," said he. Chapter 4. Daylight at last. Captain Bill rubbed his eyes, lit a match and consulted his watch. 9 o'clock. Yes, I guess it's another day, sure enough. "Shall we go on?" he asked. "Of course," replied the Orc. "Unless this tunnel is different from everything else in the world and has no end, we'll find a way out of it sooner or later." The sailor gently wakened Trot. She felt much rested by her long sleep and sprang to her feet eagerly. "Let's start, Captain," was all she said. They resumed the journey and had only taken a few steps when the Orc cried, "Wow!" and made a great fluttering of its wings and a whirling of its tail. The others, who were following a short distance behind, stopped abruptly. "What's the matter?" asked Captain Bill. "Give us a light," was the reply. "I think we've come to the end of the tunnel." Then, while Captain Bill lighted a candle, the creature added, "If that is true, we needn't have wakened so soon, for we were almost at the end of this place when we went to sleep." The sailor man and Trot came forward with a light. The wall of rock really faced the tunnel, but now they saw that the opening made a sharp turn to the left. So they followed on by a narrow passage and then made another sharp turn, this time to the right. "Blow out the light, Captain," said the Orc, in a pleased voice. "We've struck daylight. Daylight at last." A shaft of mellow light fell almost at their feet as Trot and the sailor turned the corner of the passage, but it came from above, and raising their eyes they found they were at the bottom of a deep, rocky well, with the top far, far above their heads. And here the passage ended. For a while they gazed in silence, at least two of them being filled with dismay at the sight. But the Orc merely whistled softly and said cheerfully, "That was the toughest journey I ever had the misfortune to undertake, and I'm glad it's over. Yet unless I can manage to fly to the top of this pit, we are entombed here forever." "Do you think there is room enough for you to fly in?" asked the little girl anxiously, and Captain Bill added, "It's a straight-up shaft, so I don't see how you ever manage it." Were I an ordinary bird, one of those horrid feathered things, I wouldn't even make the attempt to fly out, said the Orc. But my mechanical propeller tail can accomplish wonders, and whenever you're ready I'll show you a trick that is worthwhile. Oh, exclaimed Trot. Do you intend to take us up too? Why not, I thought, said Cap'n Bill, as you'd go first and then send somebody to help us by letting down a rope. Ropes are dangerous, replied the Orc, and I might not be able to find one to reach all this distance. Besides, it stands to reason that if I can get out myself, I can also carry you two with me. Well, I'm not afraid, said Trot, who longed to be on the earth's surface again. Suppose we fall, suggested Cap'n Bill, doubtfully. Why, in that case, we would all fall together, returned the Orc. Get aboard, little girl, sit across my shoulders, and put both your arms around my neck. Trot obeyed, and when she was seated on the Orc, Cap'n Bill inquired, How about me, Mr. Orc? Why, I think you'd best grab hold of my rear legs and let me carry you up in that manner, was the reply. Cap'n Bill looked way up at the top of the well, and then he looked at the Orc's slender, skinny legs, and heaved a deep sigh. It's going to be some dangle, I guess, but if you don't waste too much time on the way up, I may be able to hang on, said he. All ready then, cried the Orc, and at once his whirling tail began to revolve. Trot felt herself rising into the air. When the creature's legs left the ground, Cap'n Bill grasped two of them firmly and held on for dear life. The Orc's body was tipped straight upward, and Trot had to embrace the neck very tightly to keep from sliding off. Even in this position, the Orc had trouble in escaping the rough sides of the well. Several times it exclaimed, "Wow!" as it bumped its back, or a wing hit against some jagged projection. But the tail kept whirling with remarkable swiftness, and the daylight grew brighter and brighter. It was indeed a long journey from the bottom to the top, yet almost before Trot realized they had come so far, they popped out of the hole into the clear air and sunshine, and a moment later the Orc alighted gently upon the ground. The release was so sudden that even with the creature's care for its passengers, Cap'n Bill struck the earth with a shock that sent him rolling heel over head. But by the time Trot had slid down from her seat, the old sailor man was sitting up and looking around him with much satisfaction. "It's sort of pretty here," said he. "Earth is a beautiful place," cried Trot. "I wonder where on earth we are," pondered the Orc, turning first one bright eye and then the other to this side and that. Trees there were, in plenty, and shrubs and flowers and green turf. But there were no houses, there were no paths, there was no sign of civilization whatever. Just before I settled down on the ground, I thought I caught a view of the ocean, said the Orc. "Let's see if I was right." Then he flew to a little hill nearby, and Trot and Cap'n Bill followed him more slowly. When they stood on the top of the hill, they could see the blue waves of the ocean in front of them, to the right of them, and at the left of them. Behind the hill was a forest that shut out the view. "I hope it ain't an island, Trot," said Cap'n Bill gravely. "If it is, I suppose we're prisoners," she replied. "Exactly so, Trot. But even so, it's better than those terrible underground tunnels and caverns," declared the girl. "You are right, little one," agreed the Orc. "Anything above ground is better than the best that lies underground. So let's not quarrel with our fate, but be thankful we've escaped." "We are indeed," she replied, "but I wonder if we can find something to eat in this place." "Let's explore and find out," proposed Cap'n Bill. "Those trees over at the left look like cherry trees." On the way to them, the explorers had to walk through a tangle of vines, and Cap'n Bill, who went first, stumbled and pitched forward on his face. "Why, it's a melon," cried Trot delightedly as she saw what had caused the sailor to fall. Cap'n Bill rose to his foot, for he was not at all hurt, and examined the melon. But he took his big jackknife from his pocket and cut the melon open. It was quite ripe and looked delicious. But the old man tasted it before he permitted Trot to eat any. Deciding it was good, he gave her a big slice and then offered the Orc some. The creature looked at the fruit somewhat disdainfully at first, but once he had tasted its flavor, he ate of it as heartily as did the others. Among the vines they discovered many other melons, and Trot said gratefully, "Well, there's no danger of our starving, even if this is an island." "Melons," remarked Cap'n Bill, "are both food and water. We couldn't have struck anything better." Farther on they came to the cherry trees where they obtained some of the fruit, and at the edge of the little forest were wild plums. The forest itself consisted entirely of nut trees, walnuts, filberts, almonds, and chestnuts, so there would be plenty of wholesome food for them while they remained there. Cap'n Bill and Trot decided to walk through the forest to discover what was on the other side of it, but the Orc's feet were still so sore and lumpy from walking on the rocks that the creature said he preferred to fly over the treetops and meet them on the other side. The forest was not large, so by walking briskly for 15 minutes, they reached its farthest edge and saw before them the shore of the ocean. "It's an island, all right," said Trot with a sigh. "Yes, and a pretty island too," said Cap'n Bill, trying to conceal his disappointment on Trot's account. "I guess, partner, if the worst comes to the worst, I could build a raft or even a boat from those trees, so we could sail away in it." The little girl brightened at this suggestion. "I don't see the Orc anywhere," she remarked, looking around. Then her eyes lighted upon something, and she exclaimed, "Oh, Cap'n Bill, isn't that a house over there, to the left?" Cap'n Bill, looking closely, saw a shed-like structure built at one edge of the forest. "Seems like it, Trot. Not that I'd call it much of a house, but it's a building all right. Let's go over and see if it's occupied." Chapter 5. The Little Old Man of the Island. A few steps brought them to the shed, which was merely a roof of boughs built over a square space, with some branches of trees fastened to the sides to keep off the wind. The front was quite open and faced the sea, and as our friends came nearer, they observed a little man with a long pointed beard sitting motionless on a stool and staring thoughtfully out over the water. "Get out of the way, please," he called in a fretful voice. "Can't you see you are obstructing my view?" "Good morning," said Cap'n Bill politely. "It isn't a good morning," snapped the little man. "I've seen plenty of mornings better than this. Do you call it a good morning when I'm pestered with such a crowd as you?" Trot was astonished to hear such words from a stranger whom they had greeted quite properly, and Cap'n Bill grew red at the little man's rudeness. But the sailor said in a quiet tone of voice, "Are you the only ones as lives on this here island?" "Your grammar's bad," was the reply, "but this is my own exclusive island, and I'll thank you to get off. Get off it as soon as possible." "We'd like to do that," said Trot, and then she and Cap'n Bill turned away and walked down to the shore to see if any other land was in sight. The little man rose and followed them, although both were now too provoked to pay any attention to him. "Nothing in sight, partner," reported Cap'n Bill, shading his eyes with his hand. "So we'll have to stay here for a time anyhow. It isn't a bad place, Trot, by any means." "That's all you know about it," broke in the little man. "The trees are altogether too green, and the rocks are harder than they ought to be. I find the sand very grainy and the water dreadfully wet. Every breeze makes a draught and the sun shines in the daytime when there's no need of it, and disappears just as soon as it begins to get dark. If you remain here, you'll find the island very unsatisfactory. Trot turned to look at him, and her sweet face was grave and curious. "I wonder who you are," she said. "My name is Pessim," said he, with an air of pride. "I'm called the Observer." "Oh. What do you observe?" asked the little girl. "Everything I see," was the reply, in a more surly tone. Then Pessim drew back with a startled exclamation and looked at some footprints in the sand. "Why, good gracious me," he cried in distress. "What's the matter now?" asked Cap'n Bill. "Someone has pushed the earth in. Don't you see it?" "It isn't pushed in far enough to hurt anything," said Trot, examining the footprints. "Everything hurts. That isn't right," insisted the man. "If the earth were pushed in a mile, it would be a great calamity, wouldn't it?" "I suppose so," admitted the little girl. "Well, here it is pushed in a full inch. That's 1/12 of a foot, or a little more than 1/millionth part of a mile. Therefore, it is 1/1,000,000th part of a calamity." "Oh dear, how dreadful," said Pessim in a wailing voice. "Try to forget it, sir," advised Cap'n Bill soothingly. "It's beginning to rain. Let's get under your shed and keep dry." "Raining? Is it really raining?" asked Pessim, beginning to weep. "It is," answered Cap'n Bill, as the drops began to descend. "And I don't see any way to stop it, although I'm some observer myself." "No, we can't stop it, I fear," said the man. "Are you very busy just now?" "I won't be after I get to the shed," replied the sailor man. "Then do me a favor, please," begged Pessim, walking briskly along behind them, for they were hastening to the shed. "Depends on what it is," said Cap'n Bill. "I wish you would take my umbrella down to the shore and hold it over the poor fishes till it stops raining." "I'm afraid they'll get wet," said Pessim. Trot laughed, but Cap'n Bill thought the little man was poking fun at him, and so he scowled upon Pessim in a way that showed he was angry. They reached the shed before getting very wet, although the rain was now coming down in big drops. The roof of the shed protected them, and while they stood watching the rainstorm, something buzzed in and circled around Pessim's head. At once the observer began beating it away with his hands, crying out, "A bumblebee! A bumblebee! The queerest bumblebee I ever saw!" Cap'n Bill and Trot both looked at it, and the little girl said in surprise, "Dear me, it's a wee little auk." "That's what it is, sure enough," exclaimed Cap'n Bill. "Really, it wasn't much bigger than a big bumblebee, and when it came toward Trot, she allowed it to alight on her shoulder." "It's me, all right," said a very small voice in her ear, "but I'm in an awful pickle just the same." "What? Are you our auk, then?" demanded the girl, much amazed. "No, I'm my own auk, but I'm the only auk you know," replied the tiny creature. "What's happened to you?" asked the sailor, putting his head close to Trot's shoulder in order to hear the reply better. Pessim also put his head close, and the auk said, "You will remember that when I left you I started to fly over the trees, and just as I got to this side of the forest, I saw a bush that was loaded down with the most luscious fruit you can imagine. The fruit was about the size of a gooseberry, and of a lovely lavender color. So I swooped down and picked off one in my bill and ate it. At once I began to grow small. I could feel myself shrinking away, and it frightened me terribly, so that I lighted on the ground to think over what was happening. In a few seconds I had shrunk to the size you now see me. But there I remained, getting no smaller, indeed, but no larger. It is certainly a dreadful affliction. After I had recovered somewhat from the shock, I began to search for you. It is not so easy to find one's way when a creature is so small, but fortunately, I spied you here in this shed and came to you at once." Cap'n Bill and Trot were much astonished at this story and felt grieved for the poor orc. But the little man, Pessim, seemed to think it a good idea of a joke. He began laughing when he heard the story and laughed until he choked, after which he lay down on the ground and rolled and laughed again, while the tears of merriment coursed down his wrinkled cheeks. Oh dear, he finally gasped, sitting up and wiping his eyes. "This is too rich. It's almost too joyful to be true." "I don't see anything funny about it," remarked Trot indignantly. "You would if you'd had my experience," said Pessim, getting upon his feet and gradually resuming his solemn and dissatisfied expression of countenance. "The same thing happened to me." "Oh, did it? And how did you happen to come to this island?" asked the girl. "I didn't come. The neighbors brought me," replied the little man, with a frown at the recollection. "They said I was quarrelsome and fault-finding and blamed me because I told them all the things that went wrong, or never were right, and because I told them how things ought to be. So they brought me here and left me all alone, saying that if I quarrelled with myself, no one else would be made unhappy." "Absurd, wasn't it?" "Seems to me," said Cap'n Bill, "those neighbors did the proper thing." "Well," resumed Pessim, "when I found myself king of this island, I was obliged to live upon fruits, and I found many fruits growing here that I had never seen before. I tasted several and found them good and wholesome. But one day, I ate a lavender berry, as the orc did, and immediately I grew so small that I was scarcely 2 inches high. It was a very unpleasant condition, and like the orc, I became frightened. I could not walk very well, nor very far, for every lump of earth in my way seemed a mountain, every blade of grass a tree, and every grain of sand a rocky boulder. For several days I stumbled around in an agony of fear. Once a tree toad nearly gobbled me up, and if I ran out from the shelter of the bushes, the gulls and cormorants swooped down upon me. Finally, I decided to eat another berry and become nothing at all, since life, to one as small as I was, had become a dreary nightmare. At last I found a small tree that I thought bore the same fruit as that I had eaten. The berry was dark purple instead of light lavender, but otherwise it was quite similar. Being unable to climb the tree, I was obliged to wait underneath it until a sharp breeze arose and shook the limbs so that a berry fell. Instantly I seized it, and taking a last view of the world, as I then thought, I ate the berry in a twinkling. Then, to my surprise, I began to grow big again, until I became of my former stature, and so I have since remained. Needless to say, I have never eaten again of the lavender fruit, nor do any of the beasts or birds that live upon this island eat it." They had all 3 listened eagerly to this amazing tale, and when it was finished, the orc exclaimed, "Do you think then that the deep purple berry is the antidote for the lavender one?" "I'm sure of it," answered Pessim. "Then lead me to the tree at once," begged the orc, "for this tiny form I now have terrifies me greatly." Pessim examined the orc closely. "You are ugly enough as you are," said he. "Were you any larger, you might be dangerous." "Oh no," Trot assured him. "The orc has been our good friend. Please take us to the tree." Then Pessim consented, although rather reluctantly. He led them to the right, which was the east side of the island, and in a few minutes brought them near to the edge of the grove, which faced the shore of the ocean. Here stood a small tree bearing berries of a deep purple colour. The fruit looked very enticing, and Cap'n Bill reached up and selected one that seemed especially plump and ripe. The York had remained perched upon Trot's shoulder, but now it flew down to the ground. It was so difficult for Cap'n Bill to kneel down with his wooden leg that the little girl took the berry from him and held it close to the York's head. "It's too big to go into my mouth," said the little creature, looking at the fruit sidewise. "You'll have to make several mouthfuls of it, I guess," said Trot, and that is what the York did. He pecked at the soft ripe fruit with his bill and ate it up very quickly because it was good. Even before he had finished the berry, they could see the York begin to grow. In a few minutes he had regained his natural size and was strutting before them, quite delighted with his transformation. "Well, well, what do you think of me now?" he asked proudly. "You are very skinny and remarkably ugly," declared Pessim. "You are a poor judge of orcs," was the reply. "Anyone can see that I'm much handsomer than those dreadful things called birds, which are all fluff and feathers." "Their feathers make soft beds," asserted Pessim. "And my skin would make excellent drumheads," retorted the York. "Nevertheless, a plucked bird or a skinned orc would be of no value to himself, so we needn't brag of our usefulness after we are dead. But for the sake of argument, friend Pessim, I'd like to know what good you would be, were you not alive." "Never mind that," said Cap'n Bill. "He isn't much good as he is." "I am king of this island, allow me to say, and you're intruding on my property," declared the little man, scowling upon them. "If you don't like me, and I'm sure you don't, for no one else does, why don't you go away and leave me to myself?" "Well, the York can fly, but we can't," explained Trot in answer. "We don't want to stay here a bit, but I don't see how we can get away. You can go back into the hole you came from." Cap'n Bill shook his head. Trot shuddered at the thought. The York laughed aloud. "You may be king here," the creature said to Pessim, "but we intend to run this island to suit ourselves, for we are 3 and you are 1, and the balance of power lies with us." The little man made no reply to this, although as they walked back to the shed, his face wore its fiercest scowl. Cap'n Bill gathered a lot of leaves and, assisted by Trot, prepared 2 nice beds in opposite corners of the shed. Pessim slept in a hammock which he swung between 2 trees. They required no dishes, as all their food consisted of fruits and nuts picked from the trees. They made no fire, for the weather was warm and there was nothing to cook. The shed had no furniture other than the rude stool which the little man was accustomed to sit upon. He called it his throne, and they let him keep it. So they lived upon the island for 3 days, and rested and ate to their heart's content. Still, they were not at all happy in this life because of Pessim. He continually found fault with them, and all that they did, and all their surroundings. He could see nothing good or admirable in all the world, and Trot soon came to understand why the little man's former neighbours had brought him to this island and left him there, all alone, so he could not annoy anyone. It was their misfortune that they had been led to this place by their adventures, for often they would have preferred the company of a wild beast to that of Pessim. On the 4th day, a happy thought came to the York. They had all been racking their brains for a possible way to leave the island, and discussing this or that method, without finding a plan that was practical. Cap'n Bill had said he could make a raft of the trees, big enough to float them all, but he had no tools except those 2 pocket knives, and it was not possible to chop down tree with such small blades. "And suppose we got afloat on the ocean," said Trot. "Where would we drift to, and how long would it take us to get there?" Cap'n Bill was forced to admit he didn't know. The York could fly away from the island any time it wished to, but the queer creature was loyal to his new friends and refused to leave them in such a lonely, forsaken place. It was when Trot urged him to go on this fourth morning that the Orc had his happy thought. "I will go," said he, "if you two will agree to ride upon my back." "We are too heavy. You might drop us," objected Cap'n Bill. "Yes, you are rather heavy for a long journey," acknowledged the Orc, "but you might eat of those lavender berries and become so small that I could carry you with ease." This quaint suggestion startled Trot, and she looked gravely at the speaker while she considered it. But Cap'n Bill gave a scornful snort and asked, "What would become of us afterward? We wouldn't be much good if we were some 2 or 3 inches high. No, Mr. Orc, I'd rather stay here as I am than be a hip of my thumb somewhere else." "Why couldn't you take some of the dark purple berries along with you to eat after we had reached our destination?" inquired the Orc. "Then you could grow big again whenever you pleased." Trot clapped her hands with delight. "That's it," she exclaimed. "Let's do it, Cap'n Bill." The old sailor did not like the idea at first, but he thought it over carefully, and the more he thought, the better it seemed. "How could you imagine to carry us if we were so small?" he asked. "I could put you in a paper bag and tie the bag around my neck." "But we haven't a paper bag," objected Trot. The Orc looked at her. "There's your sunbonnet," it said presently, "which is hollow in the middle and has 2 strings that you could tie around my neck." Trot took off her sunbonnet and regarded it critically. Yes, it might easily hold both of her and Cap'n Bill after they had eaten the lavender berries and been reduced in size. She tied the strings around the Orc's neck, and the sunbonnet made a bag in which 2 tiny people might ride without danger of falling out. So she said, "I believe we'll do it that way, Captain." Cap'n Bill groaned, but could make no logical objection except that the plan seemed to him quite dangerous, and dangerous in more ways than one. "I think so myself," said Trot soberly. "But nobody can stay alive without getting into some danger. Sometimes. And danger doesn't mean getting hurt, Captain. It only means we might get hurt. So I guess we'll have to take the risk." "Let's go and find the berries," said Orc. They said nothing to Pessim, who was sitting on his stool and scowling dismally as he stared at the ocean, but started at once to seek the trees that bore the magic fruits. The Orc remembered very well where the lavender berries grew and led his companions quickly to the spot. Cap'n Bill gathered 2 berries and placed them carefully in his pocket. Then they went around to the east side of the island and found the tree that bore the dark purple berries. "I guess I'll take 4 of these," said the sailor man. "So, in case one doesn't make us grow big, we can eat another." "Better take 6, advised the Orc. "It's well to be on the safe side, and I'm sure these trees grow nowhere else in the world." So Cap'n Bill gathered 6 of the purple berries, and with their precious fruit, they returned to the shed to bid goodbye to Pessim. Perhaps they would not have granted the surly little man this courtesy had they not wished to use him to tie the sunbonnet around the Orc's neck. When Pessim learned they were about to leave him, he at first looked greatly pleased, but he suddenly recollected that nothing ought to please him, and so began to grumble about being left alone. "We knew it wouldn't suit you," remarked Cap'n Bill. "It didn't suit you to have us here, and it won't suit you to have us go away." "That is quite true," admitted Pessim. "I haven't been suited since I can remember, so it doesn't matter to me in the least whether you go or stay." He was interested in their experiment, however, and willingly agreed to assist, although he prophesied they would fall out of the sunbonnet on their way and be either drowned in the ocean or crushed upon some rocky shore. This uncheerful prospect did not daunt Trot, but it made Cap'n Bill quite nervous. "I will eat my berry first," said Trot, as she placed her sunbonnet on the ground in such a manner that they could get into it. Then she ate the lavender berry, and in a few seconds became so small that Cap'n Bill picked her up gently with his thumb and one finger and placed her in the middle of the sunbonnet. Then he placed beside her the 6 purple berries, each one being about as big as the tiny Trot's head. And all preparations being now made, the old sailor ate his lavender berry and became very small, wooden leg and all. Cap'n Bill stumbled sadly in trying to climb over the edge of the sunbonnet and pitched in beside Trot head first, which caused the unhappy Pessim to laugh with glee. Then the king of the island picked up the sunbonnet so rudely that he shook its occupants like peas in a pod and tied it, by means of its strings, securely around the Orc's neck. "I hope, Trot, you sewed those strings on tight," said Cap'n Bill anxiously. "Why, we are not very heavy, you know," she replied, "so I don't think the stitches will hold. But be careful and not crush the berries, Captain." "One is jammed already," he said, looking at them. "Already?" asked the Orc. "Yes," they cried together, and Pessim came close to the sunbonnet and called out to them. "You'll be smashed or drowned, I'm sure you will. But farewell, and good riddance to you." The Orc was provoked by this unkind speech, so he turned his tail toward the little man and made it revolve so fast that the rush of air tumbled Pessim over backward, and he rolled several times upon the ground before he could stop himself and sit up. By that time, the Orc was high in the air and speeding swiftly over the ocean. Chapter 6. The Flight of the Midgets. Cap'n Bill and Trot rode very comfortably in the sunbonnet. The motion was quite steady, for they weighed so little that the Orc flew without effort. Yet they were both somewhat nervous about their future fate and could not help wishing they were safe on land and their natural size again. "You're terribly small, Trot," remarked Cap'n Bill, looking at his companion. "Same to you, Captain," she said with a laugh. "But as long as we have the purple berries, we needn't worry about our size." "In a circus," mused the old man, "we'd be curiosities. But in a sunbonnet, high up in the air, sailing over a big, unknown ocean, there ain't no word in a dictionary to describe us." "Why, we're midgets, that's all," said the little girl. The Orc flew silently for a long time. The slight swaying of the sunbonnet made Cap'n Bill drowsy, and he began to doze. Trot, however, was wide awake, and after enduring the monotonous journey as long as she was able to, she called out, "Don't you see land anywhere, Mr. Orc?" "Not yet," he answered. "This is a big ocean, and I've no idea in which direction the nearest land to that island lies. But if I keep flying in a straight line, I'm sure I'll reach some place sometime." That seemed reasonable, so the little people in the sunbonnet remained as patient as possible. That is, Cap'n Bill dozed and Trot tried to remember her geography lessons so she could figure out what land they were likely to arrive at. For hours and hours the Orc flew steadily, keeping to the straight line and searching with his eyes the horizon of the ocean for land. Cap'n Bill was fast asleep and snoring, and Trot had laid her head on his shoulder to rest it, when suddenly the Orc exclaimed, "There, I've caught a glimpse of land at last!" At this announcement they roused themselves. Cap'n Bill stood up and tried to peek over the edge of the sunbonnet. "What does it look like?" he inquired. "Looks like another island," said the Orc, "but I can judge it better in a minute or two." "I don't care much for islands since we visited that other one," declared Trot. Soon the Orc made another announcement. "It is surely an island, and a little one too," said he. "But I won't stop, because I see a much bigger land straight ahead of it." "That's right," approved Cap'n Bill. "The bigger the land, the better it will suit us." "It's almost a continent," continued the Orc, after a brief silence, during which he did not decrease the speed of his flight. I wonder if it can be Auckland, the place where I have been seeking so long. I hope not, whispered Trot to Cap'n Bill, so softly that the Orc could not hear her, for I shouldn't like to be in a country where only Orcs live. This one Orc isn't a bad companion, but a lot of him wouldn't be much fun. After a few more minutes of flying, the Orc called out in a sad voice, "No, this is not my country. It's a place I have never seen before, although I have wandered far and wide. It seems to be all mountains and deserts and green valleys and queer cities and lakes and rivers, mixed up in a very puzzling way." "Most countries are like that," commented Cap'n Bill. "Are you going to land?" "Pretty soon," was the reply. "There is a mountain peak just ahead of me. What do you say to our landing on that?" "All right," agreed the sailor man, for both he and Trot were getting tired of riding in the sunbonnet and longed to set foot on solid ground again. So, in a few minutes the Orc slowed down his speed and then came to a stop so easily that they were scarcely jarred at all. Then the creature squatted down until the sunbonnet rested on the ground and began trying to unfasten with its claws the knotted strings. This proved a very clumsy task because the strings were tied at the back of the Orc's neck, just where his claws would not easily reach. After much fumbling, he said, "I'm afraid I can't let you out, and there is no one near to help me." This was at first discouraging, but after a little thought, Cap'n Bill said, "If you don't mind, Trot, I can cut a slit in your sunbonnet with my knife." "Do," she replied. "The slits won't matter, because I can sew it up again afterward, when I'm big." So Cap'n Bill got out his knife, which was just as small, in proportion, as he was, and after considerable trouble, managed to cut a long slit in the sunbonnet. First he squeezed through the opening himself, and then helped Trot to get out. When they stood on firm ground again, their first act was to begin eating the dark purple berries which they had brought with them. 2 of these Trot had guarded carefully during the long journey by holding them in her lap, for their safety meant much to the tiny people. "But I'm not very hungry," said the little girl as she handed a berry to Cap'n Bill. "But hunger doesn't count in this case. It's like taking medicine to make you well, so we must manage to eat them somehow or other." But the berries proved quite pleasant to taste, and as Cap'n Bill and Trot nibbled at their edges, their forms began to grow in size, slowly but steadily. The bigger they grew, the easier it was for them to eat the berries, which, of course, became smaller to them, and by the time the fruit was eaten, our friends had regained their natural size. The little girl was greatly relieved when she found herself as large as she had ever been, and Cap'n Bill shared her satisfaction, for, although they had seen the effect of the berries on the Orc, they had not been sure the magic fruit would have the same effect on human beings, or that the magic would work in any other country than that in which the berries grew. "What shall we do with the other 4 berries?" asked Trot, as she picked up her sunbonnet, marvelling that she had ever been small enough to ride in it. "They're no good to us now, are they, Captain?" "I'm not sure as to that," he replied. "If they were eaten by one who had never eaten the lavender berries, they might have no effect at all. But then, contrary-wise, they might. One of them has got badly jammed, so I'll throw it away, but the other 3 I believe I'll carry with me. They're magic things, you know, and may come handy to us sometime." He now searched in his big pockets and drew out a small wooden box with a sliding cover. The sailor had kept an assortment of nails of various sizes in this box, but those he now dumped loosely into his pocket, and in the box placed the 3 sound purple berries. When this important matter was attended to, they found time to look about them and see what sort of place the Orc had landed them in. Chapter 7. The Bumpy Man. The mountain on which they had alighted was not a barren waste. but had on its sides patches of green grass, some bushes, a few slender trees, and here and there masses of tumbled rocks. The sides of the slope seemed rather steep, but with care, one could climb up or down them with ease and safety. The view from where they now stood showed pleasant valleys and fertile hills lying below the heights. Trot thought she saw some houses of queer shapes scattered about the lower landscape, and there were moving dots that might be people or animals, yet were too far away for her to see them clearly. Not far from the place where they stood was the top of the mountain, which seemed to be flat, so the Orc proposed to his companions that he would fly up and see what was there. "That's a good idea," said Trot, "'cause it's getting toward evening and we'll have to find a place to sleep." The Orc had not been gone more than a few minutes when they saw him appear on the edge of the top which was nearest them. "Come on up," he called. So Trot and Cap'n Bill began to ascend the steep slope, and it did not take them long to reach the place where the Orc awaited them. Their first view of the mountain top pleased them very much. It was a level space of wider extent than they had guessed, and upon it grew grass of a brilliant green colour. In the very centre stood a house built of stone and very neatly constructed. No one was in sight, but smoke was coming from the chimney, so with one accord all three began walking toward the house. "I wonder," said Trot, "in what country we are, and if it's very far from my home in California." "Can't say as to that, partner," answered Cap'n Bill, "but I'm mighty certain we've come a long way since we struck that whirlpool." "Yes," she agreed with a sigh, "it must be miles and miles." "Distance means nothing," said the Orc. "I have flown pretty much all over the world, trying to find my home, and it is astonishing how many little countries there are, hidden away in the cracks and corners of this big globe of Earth. If one travels, he may find some new country at every turn, and a good many of them have never yet been put upon the maps." "Perhaps this is one of them," suggested Trot. They reached the house after a brisk walk, and Cap'n Bill knocked upon the door. It was at once opened by a rugged-looking man who had bumps all over him, as Trot afterward declared. There were bumps on his head, bumps on his body, and bumps on his arms and legs and hands. Even his fingers had bumps on the ends of them. For dress he wore an old grey suit of fantastic design, which fitted him very badly because of the bumps it covered, and it could not be concealed. But the bumpy man's eyes were kind and twinkling in expression, and as soon as he saw his visitors, he bowed low and said in a rather bumpy voice, "Happy day! Come in and shut the door, for it grows cool when the sun goes down. Winter is now upon us." "Why, it isn't cold a bit outside," said Trot, "so it can't be winter yet." "You will change your mind about that in a little while," declared the bumpy man. "My bumps always tell me the state of the weather, and they feel just now as if a snowstorm was coming this way. But make yourself at home, strangers. Supper is nearly ready, and there is food enough for all." Inside the house there was but one large room, simply but comfortably furnished. It had benches, a table and a fireplace, all made of stone. On the hearth a pot was bubbling and steaming, and Trot thought it had a rather nice smell. The visitors seated themselves upon the benches except the Orc, which squatted by the fireplace, and the bumpy man began stirring the kettle briskly. "May I ask what country this is, sir?" inquired Cap'n Bill. "Goodness me, fruitcake and apple sauce, don't you know where you are?" asked the bumpy man as he stopped stirring and looked at the speaker in surprise. "No," admitted Cap'n Bill, "we've just arrived." "Lost your way?" questioned the bumpy man. "Not exactly," said Cap'n Bill. "We didn't have any way to lose." "Ah," said the bumpy man, nodding his bumpy head. "This," he announced in a solemn, impressive voice is the famous land of Mo. "Oh!" exclaimed the sailor and the girl, both in one breath. But never having heard of the land of Mo, they were no wiser than before. "I thought that would startle you," remarked the bumpy man, well pleased as he resumed his stirring. The orc watched him a while in silence and then asked, "Who may you be?" "Me?" answered the bumpy man. "Haven't you heard of me? Gingerbread and lemon juice, I'm known far and wide as the Mountaineer." They all received this information in silence at first, for they were trying to think what he could mean. Finally, Trot mustered up courage to ask, "What is a Mountaineer, please?" For answer, the man turned around and faced them, waving the spoon with which he had been stirring the kettle as he recited the following verses in a sing-song tone of voice. "Here's a mountain hard of hearing, that's sad-hearted and needs cheering. So my duty is to listen to all sounds that nature makes. So the hill won't get uneasy, get to coughing or get sneezy, for this monster bump, when frightened, is quite liable to quakes. You can hear a bell that's ringing, I can feel some people singing, but a mountain isn't sensible of what goes on, and so, when I hear a blizzard blowing, or it's raining hard or snowing, I tell it to the mountain, and the mountain seems to know. Thus I benefit all people while I'm living on this steeple, for I keep the mountain steady so my neighbours all may thrive. With my listening and my shouting, I prevent this mount from spouting, and that makes me so important that I'm glad that I'm alive." When he had finished these lines of verse, the bumpy man turned again to resume his stirring. The orc laughed softly, and Cap'n Bill whistled to himself, and Trot made up her mind that the Mountaineer must be a little crazy. But the bumpy man seemed satisfied that he had explained his position fully, and presently he placed 4 stone plates upon the table, and then lifted the kettle from the fire and poured some of its contents on each of the plates. Cap'n Bill and Trot at once approached the table, for they were hungry, but when she examined her plate, the little girl exclaimed, "Why, it's molasses candy." "To be sure," returned the bumpy man with a pleasant smile. "Eat it quick, while it's hot, for it cools very quickly this winter weather." With this he seized the stone spoon and began putting the hot molasses candy into his mouth, while the others watched him in astonishment. "Doesn't it burn you?" asked the girl. "No, indeed," said he. "Why don't you eat? Aren't you hungry?" "Yes," she replied, "I am hungry, but we usually eat our candy when it is cold and hard. We always pour molasses candy before we eat it." laughed the Mountaineer. "What a funny idea. Where in the world did you come from?" "California," she said. "California? There isn't any such place. I've heard of every place in the land of Mo, but I never before heard of California." "It isn't in the land of Mo," she explained. "Then it isn't worth talking about," declared the bumpy man, helping himself again from the steaming kettle, for he had been eating all the time he talked. "For my part," sighed Cap'n Bill, "I'd like a decent square meal, once more, just by the way of variety. In the last place there was nothing but fruit to eat, and here it's worse, for there's nothing but candy." "Molasses candy isn't so bad," said Trot. "Mine's nearly cool enough to pull already. Wait a bit, Captain, and you can eat it." A little later, she was able to gather the candy from the stone plate and begin to work it back and forth with her hands. The Mountaineer was greatly amazed at this and watched her closely. It was really good candy, and pulled beautifully, so that Trot was soon ready to cut it into chunks for eating. Cap'n Bill condescended to eat 1 or 2 pieces, and the orc ate several, but the bumpy man refused to try it. Trot finished the plate of candy herself and then asked for a drink of water. "Water?" said the Mountaineer wonderingly. "What is that?" "Something to drink. Don't you have water in Mo?" "None that ever I heard of," said he, "but I can give you some fresh lemonade. I caught it in a jar the last time it rained, which was only the day before yesterday." "Oh, does it rain lemonade here?" she inquired. "Always, and it is very refreshing and healthful." With this, he brought from a cupboard a stone jar and a dipper, and the girl found it very nice lemonade indeed. Cap'n Bill liked it too, but the orc would not touch it. "If there is no water in this country, I cannot stay here for long," the creature declared. "Water means life to the man and beast and bird." "There must be water in lemonade," said Trot. "Yes," answered the orc. "I suppose so. But there are other things in it too, and they spoil the good water." The day's adventures had made our wanderers tired, so the bumpy man brought them some blankets in which they rolled themselves and then lay down before the fire, which their host kept alive with fuel all through the night. Trot wakened several times and found the mountain ear always alert and listening intently for the slightest sound. But the little girl could hear no sound at all except the snores of Cap'n Bill. Chapter 8. Button Bright is lost and found again. Wake up, called the voice of the bumpy man. "Didn't I tell you winter was coming?" I could hear it coming with my left ear, and the proof is that it is now snowing hard outside. "Is it?" said Trot, rubbing her eyes and creeping out of her blanket. "Where I live in California, I have never seen snow, except far away, on the tops of high mountains." "Well, this is the top of a high mountain," returned the bumpy one, "and for that reason we get our heaviest snowfalls right here." The little girl went to the window and looked out. The air was filled with falling white flakes, so large in size and so queer in form that she was puzzled. "Are you certain this is snow?" she asked. "To be sure. I must get my snow shovel and turn out to shovel a path. Would you like to come with me?" "Yes," she said, and followed the bumpy man out when he opened the door. Then she exclaimed, "Why, it isn't cold a bit." "Of course not," replied the man. "It was cold last night, before the snowstorm. But snow, when it falls, is always crisp and warm." Trot gathered a handful of it. "Why, it's popcorn," she cried. "Certainly, all snow is popcorn. What did you expect it to be?" "Popcorn is not snow in my country." "Well, it is the only snow we have in the land of Mo, so you may as well make the best of it," said he, a little impatiently. "I'm not responsible for the absurd things that happen in your country, and when you're in Mo, you must do as the Mo men do. Eat some of our snow, and you will find it is good. The only fault I find with our snow is that we get too much of it at times." With this, the bumpy man set to work shoveling a path, and he was so quick and industrious that he piled up the popcorn in great banks on either side of the trail that led to the mountain top from the plains below. While he worked, Trot ate popcorn and found it crisp and slightly warm, as well as nicely salted and buttered. Presently, Cap'n Bill came out of the house and joined her. "What's this?" he asked. "Most snow," said she, "but it isn't real snow, although it falls from the sky. It's popcorn." Cap'n Bill tasted it, then he sat down in the path and began to eat. The orc came out and pecked away with its bill as fast as it could. They all liked popcorn, and they all were hungry this morning. Meantime, the flakes of most snow came down so fast that the number of them almost darkened the air. The bumpy man was now shoveling quite a distance down the mountainside, while the path behind him rapidly filled up with fresh fallen popcorn. Suddenly Trot heard him call out, "Goodness gracious, mince pie and pancakes! Here is someone buried in the snow!" She ran toward him at once, and the others followed, wading through the corn and crunching it underneath their feet. The most snow was pretty deep where the bumpy man was shoveling, and from beneath a great bank of it, he had uncovered a pair of feet. "Dear me, someone has been lost in the storm," said Cap'n Bill. "I hope he's still alive. Let's pull him out and see." He took hold of one foot and the bumpy man took hold of the other. Then they both pulled, and out from the heap of popcorn came a little boy. He was dressed in a brown velvet jacket and knickerbockers, with brown stockings, buckled shoes, and a blue shirtwaist that had frills down its front. When drawn from the heap, the boy was chewing a mouthful of popcorn, and both his hands were full of it. So, at first, he couldn't speak to his rescuers, but lay quite still and eyed them calmly until he had swallowed his mouthful. Then he said, "Get my cap," and stuffed more popcorn into his mouth. While the bumpy man began shoveling into the corn bank to find the boy's cap, Trot was laughing joyfully, and Cap'n Bill had a broad grin on his face. The Orc looked from one to another and asked, "Who is the stranger?" "Why, it's Button-Bright, of course," answered Trot. "If anyone ever finds a lost boy, he can make up his mind it's Button-Bright. But how he ever came to be lost in this far-away country is more than I can make out." "Where does he belong?" inquired the Orc. "His home used to be in Philadelphia, I think, but I'm quite sure Button-Bright doesn't belong anywhere." "That's right," said the boy, nodding his head as he swallowed the second mouthful. "Everyone belongs somewhere," remarked the Orc. "Not me," insisted Button-Bright. "I'm halfway round the world from Philadelphia, and I've lost my magic umbrella that used to carry me everywhere. Stands to reason that if I can't get back, I haven't any home. But I don't care much. This is a pretty good country, Trot. I've had lots of fun here." By this time, the mountain ear had secured the boy's cap and was listening to the conversation with much interest. "It seems you know this poor snow-covered castaway," he said. "Yes, indeed," answered Trot. "We made a journey together to Sky Island once, and were good friends." "Well, then I'm glad I saved his life," said the bumpy man. "Much obliged, Mr. Nobbs," said Button-Bright, sitting up and staring at him. "But I don't believe you saved anything except some popcorn that I might have eaten had you not disturbed me." It was nice and warm in that bank of popcorn, and there was plenty to eat. "What made you dig me out? And what makes you so bumpy everywhere?" "As for the bumps," replied the man, looking at himself with much pride, "I was born with them, and I suspect they were a gift from the fairies. They make me look rugged and big, like the mountain I serve." "All right," said Button-Bright, and began eating popcorn again. It had stopped snowing now, and great flocks of birds were gathering around the mountainside, eating the popcorn with much eagerness, and scarcely noticing the people at all. There were birds of every size and colour, most of them having gorgeous feathers and plumes. "Just look at them," exclaimed the Orc scornfully. "Aren't they dreadful creatures, all covered with feathers?" "I think they're beautiful," said Trot, and this made the Orc so indignant that he went back into the house and sulked. Button-Bright reached out his hand and caught a big bird by the leg. At once it rose into the air, and it was so strong that it nearly carried the little boy with it. He let go of the leg in a hurry, and the bird flew down again and began to eat of the popcorn, not being frightened in the least. This gave Cap'n Bill an idea. He felt in his pocket and drew out several pieces of stout string. Moving very quietly, so as not to alarm the birds, he crept up to several of the biggest ones and tied cords around their legs, thus making them prisoners. The birds were so intent on their eating that they did not notice what had happened to them, and when about 20 had been captured in this manner, Cap'n Bill tied the ends of all the strings together and fastened them to a huge stone so they could not escape. The bumpy man watched the old sailor's actions with much curiosity. "The birds will be quiet until they've eaten up all the snow," he said, "but then they will want to fly away to their homes. Tell me, sir, what will the poor things do when they find they can't fly?" "It may worry them a little," replied Cap'n Bill, "but they're not going to be hurt if they take it easy and behave themselves." Our friends had all made a good breakfast of a delicious popcorn, and now they walked toward the house again. Button-Bright walked beside Trot and held her hand in his, because they were old friends and he liked the little girl very much. The boy was not so old as Trot, and small as she was, he was half a head shorter in height. The most remarkable thing about Button-Bright was that he was always quiet and composed, whatever happened, and nothing was ever able to astonish him. Trot liked him because he was not rude and never tried to plague her. Cap'n Bill liked him because he had found the boy cheerful and brave at all times, and willing to do anything he was asked to do. When they came to the house, Trot sniffed the air and asked, "Don't I smell perfume?" "I think you do," said the bumpy man. "You smell violets, and that proves there is a breeze springing up from the south. All our winds and breezes are perfumed, and for that reason we are glad to have them blow in our direction. The south breeze always has a violet odor, the north breeze has a fragrance of wild roses, the east breeze is perfumed with lilies of the valley, and the west wind with lilac blossoms. So we need no weather vane to tell us which way the wind is blowing. We have only to smell the perfume and it informs us at once." Inside the house they found the Orc, and Button-Bright regarded the strange bird-like creature with curious interest. After examining it closely for a time, he asked, "Which way does your tail whirl?" "Either way," said the Orc. Button-Bright put out his hand and tried to spin it. "Don't do that," exclaimed the Orc. "Why not?" inquired the boy. "Because it happens to be my tail, and I reserve the right to whirl it myself," explained the Orc. "Let's go out and fly somewhere," proposed Button-Bright. "I want to see how the tail works." "Not now," said the Orc. "I appreciate your interest in me, which I fully deserve, but I only fly when I'm going somewhere, and if I got started I might not stop." "That reminds me," remarked Cap'n Bill, "to ask you, friend Orc, how we are going to get away from here." "Get away?" exclaimed the bumpy man. "Why don't you stay here? You won't find any nicer place than Mo." "Have you been anywhere else, sir?" "No, I can't say that I have," admitted the mountaineer. "Then permit me to say you're no judge," declared Cap'n Bill. "But you haven't answered my question, friend Orc. How are we to get away from this mountain?" The Orc reflected a while before he answered. "I might carry one of you, the boy or the girl, upon my back," said he. "But 3 big people are more than I can manage. Although I have carried 2 of you for a short distance, you ought not to have eaten those purple berries so soon." "Perhaps we did a mistake," Cap'n Bill acknowledged, "or we might have brought some of those lavender berries with us, instead of so many purple ones," suggested Trot regretfully. Cap'n Bill made no reply to this statement, which showed he did not fully agree with the little girl. But he fell into deep thought, with wrinkled brows, and finally he said, "If those purple berries would make anything grow bigger, whether I'd eaten the lavender ones or not, I could find a way out of our troubles." They did not understand this speech and looked at the old sailor as if expecting him to explain what he meant. But just then, a chorus of shrill cries rose from outside. "Here, let me go, let me go," the voices seemed to say. "Why are we insulted in this way? Mountaineer, come and help us." Trot ran to the window and looked out. "It's the birds you caught, Captain," she said. "I didn't know they could talk." "Oh yes, all the birds in Mo are educated to talk," said the bumpy man. Then he looked at Cap'n Bill uneasily and added, Won't you let the poor things go?" "I'll see," replied the sailor, and walked out to where the birds were fluttering and complaining because the strings would not allow them to fly away. "Listen to me," he cried, and at once they became still. "We 3 people, who are strangers in your land, want to go to some other country, and we want 3 of you birds to carry us there. We know we are asking a great favor, but it's the only way we can think of, except walking, and I'm not much good at that because I have a wooden leg. Besides, Trot and Button-Bright are too small to undertake a long and tiresome journey. Now tell me, which 3 of you birds will consent to carry us?" The birds looked at one another as if greatly astonished. Then one of them replied, "You must be crazy, old man. Not one of us is big enough to fly with even the smallest of your party." "I'll fix the matter of size," promised Cap'n Bill. "If 3 of you will agree to carry us, I'll make you big and strong enough to do it, so it won't worry you a bit." The birds considered this gravely. Living in the magic country, they had no doubt but that the strange one-legged man could do what he said. After a little while, one of them asked, "If you make us big, would we stay big always?" "I think so," replied Cap'n Bill. They chatted a while amongst themselves, and then the bird that had first spoken said, "I'll go for one." "So will I," said another, and after a pause, a third said, "I'll go too." Perhaps more would have volunteered, for it seemed that for some reason they all longed to be bigger than they were. But 3 were enough for Cap'n Bill's purpose, and so he promptly released all the others, who immediately flew away. The 3 that remained were cousins, and all were of the same brilliant plumage and in size about as large as eagles. When Trot questioned them, she found they were quite young, having only abandoned their nests a few weeks before. They were strong young birds with clear, brave eyes, and the little girl decided they were the most beautiful of all the feathered creatures she had ever seen. Cap'n Bill now took from his pocket the wooden box with the sliding cover and removed the 3 purple berries, which were still in good condition. "Eat these," he said, and gave one to each of the birds. They obeyed, finding the fruit very pleasant to taste. In a few seconds, they began to grow in size and grew so fast that Trot feared they would never stop. But they finally did stop growing, and then they were much larger than the auk, and nearly the size of full-grown ostriches. Cap'n Bill was much pleased by this result. "You can carry us now, all right," said he. The birds strutted around with pride, highly pleased with their immense size. "I don't see, though," said Trot doubtfully, "how we're going to ride on their backs without falling off." "We're not going to ride on their backs," answered Cap'n Bill. "I'm going to make swings for us to ride in." He then asked the bumpy man for some rope, but the man had no rope. He had, however, an old suit of grey clothes which he gladly presented to Cap'n Bill, who cut the cloth into strips and twisted it so that it was almost as strong as rope. With this material he attached to each bird a swing that dangled below its feet, and Button-Bright made a trial flight in one of them to prove that it was safe and comfortable. When all this had been arranged, one of the birds asked, "Where do you wish us to take you?" "Why, just follow the auk," said Cap'n Bill. "He will be our leader, and wherever the auk flies, you are to fly, and wherever the auk lands, you are to land. Is that satisfactory?" The birds declared it was quite satisfactory, so Cap'n Bill took counsel with the auk. "On our way here," said the peculiar creature, "I noticed a broad, sandy desert at the left of me, on which was no living thing." "Then we better keep away from it," replied the sailor. "Not so," insisted the auk. "I have found on my travels that the most pleasant countries often lie in the middle of deserts." So I think it would be wise for us to fly over this desert and discover what lies beyond it. For in the direction we came from lies the ocean, as we well know, and beyond here is this strange land of Mo, which we do not care to explore. On one side, as we can see from this mountain, is a broad expanse of plain, and on the other, the desert. For my part, I vote for the desert. What do you say, Trot? Inquired Cap'n Bill. It's all the same to me, she replied. No one thought of asking Button-Bright's opinion, so it was decided to fly over the desert. They bade goodbye to the bumpy man and thanked him for his kindness and hospitality. Then they seated themselves in the wings, one for each bird, and told the Orc to start away, and they would follow. The whirl of the Orc's tail astonished the birds at first, but after he had gone a short distance, they rose in the air, carrying their passengers easily, and flew with strong, regular strokes of their great wings in the wake of their leader. Chapter 9. The Kingdom of Jinxland. Trot rode with more comfort than she had expected, although the swing swayed so much that she had to hold on tight with both hands. Cap'n Bill's bird followed the Orc, and Trot came next, with Button-Bright trailing behind her. It was quite an imposing procession, but unfortunately, there was no one to see it, for the Orc had headed straight for the great sandy desert, and in a few minutes after starting, they were flying high over the broad waste where no living thing could exist. The little girl thought this would be a bad place for the birds to lose strength, or for the cloth ropes to give way, but although she could not help feeling a trifle nervous and fidgety, she had confidence in a huge and brilliantly plumaged bird that bore her, as well as in Cap'n Bill's knowledge of how to twist and fasten a rope so it would hold. That was a remarkably big desert. There was nothing to relieve the monotony of view, and every minute seemed an hour, and every hour a day. Disagreeable fumes and gases rose from the sands, which would have been deadly to the travellers had they not been so high in the air. As it was, Trot was beginning to feel sick, when a breath of fresher air filled her nostrils, and, on looking ahead, she saw a great cloud of pink-tinted mist. Even while she wondered what it could be, the Orc plunged boldly into the mist, and the other birds followed. She could see nothing for a time, nor could the bird which carried her see where the Orc had gone, but it kept flying as sturdily as ever, and in a few moments the mist was past, and the girl saw a most beautiful landscape spread out below her, extending as far as her eye could reach. She saw bits of forest, verdure-clothed hills, fields of waving grain, fountains, rivers and lakes, and, throughout the scene, were scattered groups of pretty houses, and a few grand castles and palaces. Over all this delightful landscape, which from Trot's high perch seemed like a magnificent painted picture, was a rosy glow such as we sometimes see in the west at sunset. In this case, however, it was not in the west only, but everywhere. No wonder the Orc paused to circle slowly over this lovely country. The other birds followed his action, all eyeing the place with equal delight. Then, as with one accord, the four formed a group and slowly sailed downward. This brought them to that part of the newly discovered land which bordered on the desert's edge, but it was just as pretty here as anywhere, so the Orc and the birds alighted, and the 3 passengers at once got out of their swings. "Oh, Cap'n Bill, isn't this fine and dandy?" exclaimed Trot rapturously. "How lucky we were to discover this beautiful country." "The country seems rather high class, I'll admit, Trot," replied the old sailor-man, looking around him, but we don't know as yet what its people are like. No one could live in such a country without being happy and good. I'm sure of that, she said earnestly. Don't you think so, Button-Bright? I'm not thinking just now, answered the little boy. It tires me to think, and I never seem to gain anything by it. When we see the people who live here, we will know what they are like, and no amount of thinking will make them any different. That's true enough, said the Orc, but now I want to make a proposal. While you are getting acquainted with this new country, which looks as if it contains everything to make one happy, I would like to fly along, all by myself, and see if I can find my home on the other side of the Great Desert. If I do, I will stay there, of course, but if I fail to find Auckland, I will return to you in a week to see if I can do anything more to assist you. They were sorry to lose their queer companion, but could offer no objection to the plan, so the Orc bade them goodbye, and, rising swiftly in the air, he flew over the country and was soon lost to view in the distance. The three birds which had carried our friends now begged permission to return by the way they had come, to their own homes, saying they were anxious to show their families how big they had become. So Cap'n Bill and Trot and Button-Bright all thanked them gratefully for their assistance, and soon the birds began their long flight toward the land of Mo. Being now left to themselves in this strange land, the three comrades selected a pretty pathway and began walking along it. They believed this path would lead them to a splendid castle which they espied in the distance, the turrets of which towered far above the tops of the trees which surrounded it. It did not seem very far away, so they sauntered on slowly, admiring the beautiful ferns and flowers that lined the pathway, and listening to the singing of the birds and the soft chirping of the grasshoppers. Presently the path wound over a hill. In a valley that lay beyond the hill was a tiny cottage surrounded by flower beds and fruit trees. On the shady porch of the cottage they saw, as they approached, a pleasant-faced woman sitting amidst a group of children to whom she was telling stories. The children quickly discovered the strangers and ran toward them with exclamations of astonishment, so that Trot and her friends became the center of a curious group, all chattering excitedly. Cap'n Bill's wooden leg seemed to arouse the wonder of the children, as they could not understand why he had not two meat legs. This attention seemed to please the old sailor, who patted the heads of the children kindly, and then, raising his hat to the woman, he inquired, "Can you tell us, madame, just what country this is?" She stared hard at all three of the strangers as she replied briefly, "Jinxland." "Oh," exclaimed Cap'n Bill with a puzzled look. "And where is Jinxland, please?" "In the Quadling country," said she. "What?" cried Trot, in sudden excitement. "Do you mean to say this is the Quadling country of the land of Oz?" "To be sure I do," the woman answered. "Every bit of land that is surrounded by the Great Desert is the land of Oz, as you ought to know as well as I do. But I'm sorry to say that Jinxland is separated from the rest of the Quadling country by that row of high mountains you see yonder, which have very steep sides that no one can cross. So we live here all by ourselves, and are ruled by our own king, instead of by Ozma of Oz." "I've been to the land of Oz before," said Button-Bright, "but I've never been here." "Did you ever hear of Jinxland before?" asked Trot. "No," said Button-Bright. "It is on the map of Oz, though," asserted the woman, "and it's a fine country, I assure you. If only," she added, and then paused to look around her with a frightened expression. "If only," here she stopped again, as if not daring to go on with her speech. "If only what, ma'am?" asked Cap'n Bill. The woman sent the children into the house. Then she came closer to the strangers and whispered, "If only we had a different king, we would be very happy and contented." "What's the matter with your king?" asked Trot, curiously. But the woman seemed frightened to have said so much. She retreated to her porch, merely saying, The king punishes severely any treason on the part of his subjects. What's treason? Asked Button-Bright. In this case, replied Cap'n Bill, treason seems to consist of knocking the king, but I guess we know his disposition now as well as if the lady had said more. I wonder, said Trot, going up to the woman, if you could spare us something to eat. We haven't had anything but popcorn and lemonade for a long time. Bless your heart, of course I can spare you some food, the woman answered, and, entering her cottage, she soon returned with a tray loaded with sandwiches, cakes, and cheese. One of the children drew a bucket of clear, cold water from a spring, and 3 wanderers ate heartily and enjoyed the good things immensely. When Button-Bright could eat no more, he filled the pockets of his jacket with cakes and cheese, and not even the children objected to this. Indeed, they all seemed pleased to see the strangers eat, so Cap'n Bill decided that no matter what the King of Jinxland was like, the people would prove friendly and hospitable. Whose castle is that yonder, ma'am? He asked, waving his hand toward the towers that rose above the trees. It belongs to His Majesty King Krewl, she said. Oh, indeed. And does he live there? When he is not out hunting with his fierce courtiers and war captains, she replied. Is he hunting now? Trot inquired. I do not know, my dear. The less we know about the king's actions, the safer we are. It was evident the woman did not like to talk about King Krewl, and so, having finished their meal, they said goodbye and continued along the pathway. Don't you think we'd better keep away from that king's castle? Captain? Asked Trot. Well, said he, King Krewl would find out sooner or later that we are in his country, so we may as well face the music now. Perhaps he isn't quite so bad as that woman thinks he is. Kings aren't always popular with their people, you know, even if they do the best they know how. Ozma is popular, said Button-Bright. Ozma is different from any other ruler, from all I've heard, remarked Trot musingly, as she walked beside the boy. And after all, we are, really, in the land of Oz, where Ozma rules every king and everybody else. I never heard of anybody getting hurt in her dominions. Did you, Button-Bright? Not when she knows about it, he replied. But those birds landed us in just the wrong place, it seems to me. They might have carried us right on, over that row of mountains to the Emerald City. True enough, said Cap'n Bill. But they didn't, and so we must make the best of Jinxland. Let's try not to be afraid. Oh, I'm not very scared, said Button-Bright, pausing to look at a pink rabbit that popped its head out of a hole in the field nearby. Nor am I, added Trot. Really, Captain, I'm so glad to be anywhere at all in the wonderful fairyland of Oz that I think I'm the luckiest girl in all the world. Dorothy lives in the Emerald City, you know, and so does the Scarecrow, and the Tin Woodman, and Tick-Tock, and the Shaggy Man, and all the rest of them that we've heard so much about. Not to mention Ozma, who must be the sweetest and loveliest girl in all the world. Take your time, Trot, advised Button-Bright. You don't have to say it all in one breath, you know. And you haven't mentioned half of the curious people in the Emerald City. That Emerald City, said Cap'n Bill impressively, happens to be on the other side of those mountains that we're told no one is able to cross. I don't want to discourage you, Trot, but we're almost as much separated from your Ozma and Dorothy as we were when we lived in California. There was so much truth in this statement that they all walked on in silence for some time. Finally, they reached the grove of stately trees that bordered the ground of the king's castle. They had gone halfway when the sound of sobbing, as of someone in bitter distress, reached their ears and caused them to halt abruptly. Chapter 10. Pon, the Gardener's Boy. It was Button-Bright who first discovered, lying on his face beneath a broad, spreading tree near the pathway, a young man whose body shook with the force of his sobs. He was dressed in a long brown smock and had sandals on his feet, betokening one in humble life. His head was bare and showed a shock of brown curly hair. Butterbright looked down on the young man and said, "Who cares anyhow?" "I do," cried the young man, interrupting his sobs to roll over, face upward, that he might see who had spoken. "I care, for my heart is broken." "Can't you get another one?" asked the little boy. "I don't want another," wailed the young man. By this time, Trot and Cap'n Bill arrived at the spot, and the girl leaned over and said in a sympathetic voice, "Tell us your troubles and perhaps we may help you." The youth sat up, then bowed politely. Afterward he got upon his feet, but still kept wringing his hands as he tried to choke down his sobs. Trot thought he was very brave to control such awful agony so well. "My name is Pon," he began. "I'm the gardener's boy." "Then the gardener of the king is your father, I suppose," said Trot. "Not my father, but my master," was the reply. "I do the work and the gardener gives the orders. And it was not my fault in the least that the Princess Gloria fell in love with me." "Did she really?" asked the little girl. "I don't see why," remarked Button-Bright, staring at the youth. "And who may the Princess Gloria be?" inquired Cap'n Bill. "She is the niece of King Krewl, who is her guardian. The princess lives in the castle and she is the loveliest and sweetest maiden in all Jinxland. She's fond of flowers and used to walk in the gardens with her attendants. At such times, if I was working at my tasks, I used to cast down my eyes as Gloria passed me. But one day, I glanced up and found her gazing at me with a very tender look in her eyes. The next day, she dismissed her attendants and, coming to my side, began to talk with me. She said I had touched her heart as no other young man had ever done. I kissed her hand. Just then the king came round a bend in the walk. He struck me with his fist and kicked me with his foot. Then he seized the arm of the princess and rudely dragged her into the castle. "Wasn't he awful?" gasped Trot indignantly. "He's a very abrupt king," said Pon, "so it was the least I could expect. Up to that time I had not thought of loving Princess Gloria, but realizing it would be impolite not to return her love, I did so. We met at evening now and then, and she told me the king wanted her to marry a rich courtier named Googly Goo, who is old enough to be Gloria's father. She has refused Googly Goo 39 times, but he still persists and has brought many rich presents to bribe the king. On that account, King Krewl has commanded his niece to marry the old man, but the princess has assured me, time and again, that she will wed only me. This morning we happened to meet in the grape arbor, and as I was respectfully saluting the cheek of the princess, 2 of the king's guards seized me and beat me terribly before the very eyes of Gloria, whom the king himself held back so she could not interfere. "Why, this king must be a monster," cried Trot. "He's far worse than that," said Pon mournfully. "But see here," interrupted Cap'n Bill, who had listened carefully to Pon, "this king may not be so much to blame after all. Kings are proud folks because they're so high and mighty, and it isn't reasonable for a royal princess to marry a common gardener's boy." "It isn't right," declared Button-Bright. "A princess should marry a prince." "I'm not a common gardener's boy," protested Pon. "If I had my rights, I would be the king instead of Krewl. As it is, I'm a prince, and as royal as any man in Jinxland." "How does that come?" asked Cap'n Bill. "My father used to be the king, and Krewl was his prime minister. But one day, while out hunting, King Furs, that was my father's name, had a quarrel with Krewl and tapped him gently on the nose with the knuckles of his closed hands. This so provoked the wicked Krewl that he tripped my father backward, so that he fell into a deep pond. At once Krewl threw in a mass of heavy stones, which so weighted down my poor father that his body could not rise again to the surface. It is impossible to kill anyone in this land, as perhaps you know, but when my father was pressed down into the mud at the bottom of the deep pool, and the stones held him so he could never escape, he was of no more use to himself or the world than if he had died. Knowing this, Krewl proclaimed himself king, taking possession of the royal castle and driving all my father's people out. I was a small boy then, but when I grew up I became a gardener. I have served King Krewl without his knowing that I am the son of the same King First, whom he so cruelly made away with. My, but that's a terribly exciting story, said Trot, drawing a long breath. But tell us, Pon, who was Gloria's father? Oh, he was the king before my father, replied Pon. Father was prime minister for King Kind, who was Gloria's father. She was only a baby when King Kind fell into the great gulf that lies just this side of the mountains, the same mountains that separate Jinxland from the rest of the land of Oz. It is said the great gulf has no bottom, but, however that may be, King Kind has never been seen again, and my father became king in his place. Seems to me, said Trot, that if Gloria had her rights, she would be the queen of Jinxland. Well, her father was a king, admitted Pon, and so was my father, so we are of equal rank, although she's a great lady and I'm a humble gardener's boy. I can't see why we should not marry if we want to accept that King Krewl won't let us. It's a sort of mixed-up mess, taken all together, remarked Cap'n Bill, but we are on our way to visit King Krewl, and if we get a chance, young man, we'll put in a good word for you. Do, please, begged Pon. Was it the flogging you got that broke your heart? Inquired Button-Bright. Why, it helped to break it, of course, said Pon. I'd get it fixed up if I were you, advised the boy, tossing a pebble at a chipmunk in a tree. You ought to give Gloria just as good a heart as she gives you. That's common sense, agreed Cap'n Bill. So, they left the gardener's boy standing beside the path and resumed their journey toward the castle. Chapter 11. The Wicked King and Googly Goo. When our friends approached the great doorway of the castle, they found it guarded by several soldiers dressed in splendid uniforms. They were armed with swords and lances. Cap'n Bill walked straight up to them and asked, "Does the king happen to be at home?" "His magnificent and glorious majesty King Krewl is at present inhabiting his royal castle," was the stiff reply. "Then I guess we'll go in and say, how'd you do?" continued Cap'n Bill, attempting to enter the doorway. But a soldier barred his way with a lance. "Who are you? What are your names? And where do you come from?" demanded the soldier. "You wouldn't know if we told you," returned the sailor, "seeing as we're strangers in a strange land." "Oh, if you're strangers, you will be permitted to enter," said the soldier, lowering his lance. "His Majesty is very fond of strangers." "Do many strangers come here?" asked Trot. "You are the first that ever came to our country," said the man, "but His Majesty has often said that if strangers ever arrived in Jinxland, he would see that they had a very exciting time." Cap'n Bill scratched his chin thoughtfully. He wasn't very favourably impressed by the last remark, but he decided that as there was no way of escape from Jinxland, it would be wise to confront the king boldly and try to win his favour. So they entered the castle, escorted by one of the soldiers. It was certainly a fine castle, with many large rooms, all beautifully furnished. The passages were winding and handsomely decorated, and after following several of these, the soldier led them into an open court that occupied the very centre of the huge building. It was surrounded on every side by high turreted walls and contained beds of flowers, fountains, and walks of many coloured marbles, which were matched together in quaint designs. In an open space near the middle of the court, they saw a group of courtiers and their ladies, who surrounded a lean man, who wore upon his head a jewelled crown. His face was hard and sullen, and through the slits of his half-closed eyelids, the eyes glowed like coals of fire. He was dressed in brilliant satins and velvets and was seated in a golden throne chair. This personage was King Krewl, and as soon as Cap'n Bill saw him, the old sailor knew at once that he was not going to like the King of Jinxland. "Hello, who's here?" said His Majesty, with a deep scowl. "Strangers, sire," answered the soldier, bowing so low that his forehead touched the marble tiles. "Strangers, eh? Well, what an unexpected visit. Advance, strangers, and give an account of yourselves." The king's voice was as harsh as his features. Trot shuddered a little, but Cap'n Bill calmly replied, "There ain't much for us to say, except we've arrived to look over your country and see how we like it. Judging from the way you speak, you don't know who you are, or you'd be jumping up and to shake hands and offer us seats. Kings usually treat us pretty well, in the great big outside world where we come from. But in this little kingdom, which don't amount to much anyhow, folks don't seem to have much culture." The king listened with amazement to this bold speech, first with a frown, and then gazing at the two children and the old sailor with evident curiosity. The courtiers were dumb with fear, for no one had even dared speak in such a manner to their self-willed, cruel king before. His Majesty, however, was somewhat frightened, for cruel people are always cowards, and he feared these mysterious strangers might possess magic powers that would destroy him unless he treated them well. So he commanded his people to give the new arrivals seats, and they obeyed with trembling haste. After being seated, Cap'n Bill lighted his pipe and began puffing smoke from it, a sight so strange to them that it filled them all with wonder. Presently the king asked, "How did you penetrate to this hidden country? Did you cross the desert or the mountains?" "Desert," answered Cap'n Bill, as if the task were too easy to be worth talking about. "Indeed, no one has ever been able to do that before," said the king. "Well, it's easy enough if you know how," asserted Cap'n Bill, it was so careless that it had greatly impressed his hearers. The king shifted in his throne uneasily. He was more afraid of these strangers than before. "Do you intend to stay long in Jinxland?" was his next anxious question. "Depends on how we like it," said Cap'n Bill. "Just now I might suggest to you, Your Majesty, to order some rooms got ready for us in your dinky little castle here, and a royal banquet with some fried onions and pickled tripe would set easy on our stomachs and make us a bit happier than we are now." "Your wishes shall be attended to," said King Krewl, but his eyes flashed from between their slits in a wicked way that made Trot hope the food wouldn't be poisoned. At the king's command, several of his attendants hastened away to give the proper orders to the castle servants, and no sooner were they gone than a skinny old man entered the courtyard and bowed before the king. This disagreeable person was dressed in rich velvets, with many furbelows and laces. He was covered with golden chains, finely wrought rings, and jewelled ornaments. He walked with mincing steps and glared at all the courtiers as if he considered himself far superior to any or all of them. "Well, well, Your Majesty, what news, what news?" he demanded in a shrill, cracked voice. The king gave him a surly look. "No news, Lord Googly-Goo, except that strangers have arrived," he said. Googly-Goo cast a contemptuous glance at Cap'n Bill and a disdainful one at Trot and Button-Bright. Then he said, "Strangers do not interest me, Your Majesty, but the Princess Gloria is very interesting indeed. What does she say, sire? Will she marry me? Ask her, retorted the king. I have many times, and every time she has refused. Well, said the king harshly. Well, said Googly Goo in a jaunty tone. A bird that can sing, and won't sing, must be made to sing. Huh, sneered the king. That's easy with a bird, but a girl is harder to manage. Still, persisted Googly Goo, we must overcome difficulties. The chief trouble is that Gloria fancies she loves that miserable gardener's boy, Pon. Suppose we throw Pon into the great gulf, your majesty. It would do you no good, returned the king. She would still love him. Too bad, sighed Googly Goo. I have laid aside more than a bushel of precious gems, each worth a king's ransom, to present to your majesty on the day I wed Gloria. The king's eyes sparkled, for he loved wealth above everything, but the next moment he frowned deeply again. It won't help us to kill Pon, he muttered. What we must do is kill Gloria's love for Pon. That is better, if you can find a way to do it, agreed Googly Goo. Everything would come right if you could kill Gloria's love for that gardener's boy. Really, sire, now that I come to think of it, there must be fully 1.5 bushels of those jewels. Just then, a messenger entered the court to say that the banquet was prepared for the strangers. So Cap'n Bill, Trot, and Button-Bright entered the castle and were taken to a room where a fine feast was spread upon the table. I don't like that Lord Googly Goo, remarked Trot as she was busily eating. Nor I, said Cap'n Bill, but from the talk we heard, I guess the gardener's boy won't get the princess. Perhaps not, returned the girl, but I hope old Googly doesn't get her either. The king means to sell her for all those jewels, observed Button-Bright, his mouth half full of cake and jam. Poor princess, sighed Trot. I'm sorry for her, although I've never seen her. But if she says no to Googly Goo, and means it, what can they do? Don't let us worry about a strange princess, advised Cap'n Bill. I've a notion we're not too safe ourselves with this cruel king. The 2 children felt the same way, and all 3 were rather solemn during the remainder of the meal. When they had eaten, the servants escorted them to their rooms. Cap'n Bill's room was way to one end of the castle, very high up, and Trot's room was at the opposite end, rather low down. As for Button-Bright, they placed him in the middle so that all were as far apart as they could possibly be. They didn't like this arrangement very well, but all the rooms were handsomely furnished, and being guests of the king, they dared not complain. After the strangers had left the courtyard, the king and Googly Goo had a long talk together, and the king said, I cannot force Gloria to marry you just now, because those strangers may interfere. I suspect that the wooden-legged man possesses great magical powers, or he would never have been able to carry himself and those children across the deadly desert. I don't like him. He looks dangerous, answered Googly Goo. But perhaps you are mistaken about his being a wizard. Why don't you test his powers? How? Asked the king. Send for the Wicked Witch. She will tell you in a moment whether that wooden-legged person is a common man or a magician. Ha! That's a good idea, cried the king. Why didn't I think of the Wicked Witch before? But the woman demands rich rewards for her services. Never mind, I will pay her, promised the wealthy Googly Goo. So a servant was dispatched to summon the Wicked Witch, who lived but a few leagues from King Krewl's castle. While they awaited her, the withered old courtier proposed that they pay a visit to Princess Gloria and see if she was not now in a more complacent mood. So the 2 started away together and searched the castle over without finding Gloria. At last, Googly Goo suggested she might be in the rear garden, which was a large park filled with bushes and trees and surrounded by a high wall. And what was their anger when they turned a corner of the path to find, in a quiet nook, the beautiful princess, and kneeling before her, Pon, the gardener's boy. With a roar of rage, the king dashed forward, but Pon had scaled the wall by means of a ladder, which still stood in its place, and when he saw the king coming up, he ran up the ladder and made good his escape. But this left Gloria confronted by her angry guardian, the king, and by old Googly Goo, who was trembling with a fury he could not express in words. Seizing the princess by her arm, the king dragged her back to the castle. Pushing her into a room on the lower floor, he locked the door upon the unhappy girl. And at that moment, the arrival of the Wicked Witch was announced. Hearing this, the king smiled as a tiger smiles, showing his teeth. And Googly Goo smiled as a serpent smiles, for he had no teeth except a couple of fangs. And having frightened each other with these smiles, the two dreadful men went away to the royal council chamber to meet the Wicked Witch. Chapter 12. The Wooden-Legged Grasshopper. Now it so happened that Trot, from the window of her room, had witnessed the meeting of the lovers in the garden, and had seen the king come and drag Gloria away. The little girl's heart went out in sympathy for the poor princess, who seemed to her to be one of the sweetest and loveliest young ladies she had ever seen. So she crept along the passages and, from a hidden niche, saw Gloria locked in her room. The key was still in the lock, so when the king had gone away, followed by Googly Goo, Trot stole up to the door, turned the key, and entered. The princess lay prone upon a couch, sobbing bitterly. Trot went up to her and smoothed her hair and tried to comfort her. "Don't cry," she said. "I've unlocked the door so you can go away any time you want to." "It isn't that," sobbed the princess. "I am unhappy because they will not let me love Pon, the gardener's boy." "Well, never mind. Pon isn't any great shakes anyhow, seems to me," said Trot soothingly. "There are lots of other people you can love." Gloria rolled over on the couch and looked at the little girl reproachfully. "Pon has won my heart, and I can't help loving him," she explained. Then with sudden indignation she added, "But I'll never love Googly Goo, never, as long as I live." "I should say not," replied Trot. "Pon may not be much good, but old Googly is very, very bad. Hunt around and I'm sure you'll find someone worth your love. You're very pretty, you know, and almost anyone ought to love you." "You don't understand, my dear," said Gloria, as she wiped the tears from her eyes with a dainty lace handkerchief bordered with pearls. "When you are older, you will realize that a young lady cannot decide whom she will love, or choose the most worthy. Her heart alone decides for her, and whomsoever her heart selects, she must love, whether he amounts to much or not." Trot was a little puzzled by this speech, which seemed to her unreasonable, but she made no reply, and presently Gloria's grief softened, and she began to question the little girl about herself and her adventures. Trot told her how they had happened to come to Jinxland, and all about Cap'n Bill and the Orc and Pessim and the Bumpy Man. While they were thus conversing together, getting more and more friendly as they became better acquainted, in the council chamber, the king and Googly Goo were talking with the Wicked Witch. This evil creature was old and ugly. She had lost one eye and wore a black patch over it, so the people of Jinxland had named her Blinky. Of course, witches are forbidden to exist in the land of Oz, but Jinxland was so far removed from the centre of Ozma's dominions, and so absolutely cut off from it by the steep mountains and the bottomless gulf, that the laws of Oz were not obeyed very well in that country. So there were several witches in Jinxland who were the terror of the people. But King Krewl favoured them and permitted them to exercise their evil sorcery. Blinky was the leader of all the other witches and therefore the most hated and feared. The king used her witchcraft at times to assist him in carrying out his cruelties and revenge. But he was always obliged to pay Blinky large sums of money or heaps of precious jewels before she would undertake an enchantment. This made him hate the old woman almost as much as his subjects did, but today Lord Googly Goo had agreed to pay the witch's price, so the king greeted her with gracious favour. "Can you destroy the love of Princess Gloria for the gardener's boy?" inquired his majesty. The wicked witch thought about it before she replied, "That's a hard question to answer. I can do lots of clever magic, but love is a stubborn thing to conquer. When you think you've killed it, it's liable to bob up again as strong as ever. I believe love and cats have 9 lives. In other words, killing love is a hard job, even for a skillful witch. But I believe I can do something that will answer your purpose just as well." "What is that?" asked the king. "I can freeze the girl's heart. I've got a special incantation for that, and when Gloria's heart is thoroughly frozen, she can no longer love Pon." "Just the thing!" exclaimed Googly Goo, and the king was likewise much pleased. They bargained a long time as to the price, but finally the old courtier agreed to pay the wicked witch's demands. It was arranged that they should take Gloria to Blinky's house the next day to have her heart frozen. Then King Krewl mentioned to the old hag the strangers who had that day arrived in Jinxland, and said to her, "I think the 2 children, the boy and the girl, are unable to harm me, but I have a suspicion that the wooden-legged man is a powerful wizard." The witch's face wore a troubled look when she heard this. "If you are right," she said, "this wizard might spoil my incantation and interfere with me in other ways. So it will be best for me to meet this stranger at once and match my magic against his to decide which is the stronger." "All right," said the king. "Come with me and I will lead you to the man's room." Googly Goo did not accompany them, as he was obliged to go home to get the money and jewels he had promised to pay old Blinky. So the other 2 climbed several flights of stairs and went through many passages until they came to the room occupied by Cap'n Bill. The sailor man, finding his bed soft and inviting, and being tired with the adventures he had experienced, had decided to take a nap. When the wicked witch and the king softly opened the door and entered, Cap'n Bill was snoring with such vigour that he did not even hear them at all. Blinky approached the bed and with her one eye anxiously stared at the sleeping stranger. "Ah," she said in a soft whisper, "I believe you're right, King Krewl. The man looks to me like a very powerful wizard. But by good luck I have caught him asleep, so I shall transform him before he wakes up, giving him such a form that he will be unable to oppose me." "Careful," cautioned the king, also speaking low. "If he discovers that you are doing this, he may destroy you, and that would annoy me, because I need you to attend to Gloria." But the wicked witch realized as well as he did that she must be careful. She carried over her arm a black bag, from which she now drew several packets, carefully wrapped in paper. 3 of these she selected, replacing the others in the bag. 2 of the packets she mixed together, and then she cautiously opened the 3rd. "Better stand back, Your Majesty," she advised, "for if this powder falls on you, you might be transformed yourself." The king hastily retreated to the end of the room. As Blinky mixed the third powder with the others, she waved her hands over it, mumbled a few words, and then backed away as quickly as she could. Cap'n Bill was slumbering peacefully, all unconscious of what was going on. Puff, a great cloud of smoke rolled over the bed and completely hid him from view. When the smoke rolled away, both Blinky and the king saw that the body of the stranger had quite disappeared, while in his place, crouching in the middle of the bed, was a little grey grasshopper. One curious thing about this grasshopper was that the last joint of its left leg was made of wood. Another curious thing, considering it was a grasshopper, was that it began talking, crying out in a tiny but sharp voice. "Here, you people! What do you mean by treating me so? Put me back where I belong, at once, or you'll be sorry." The cruel king turned pale at hearing the grasshopper's threats, but the wicked witch merely laughed in derision. Then she raised her stick and aimed a vicious blow at the grasshopper. But before the stick struck the bed, the tiny hopper made a marvelous jump, marvelous indeed when we consider that it had a wooden leg. It rose in the air and sailed across the room and passed right through the open window, where it disappeared from their view. "Good," shouted the king. "We are well rid of this desperate wizard." And then they both laughed heartily at the success of the incantation, and went away to complete their horrid plans. After Trot had visited a time with Princess Gloria, the little girl went to Button-Bright's room, but did not find him there. Then she went to the captain's room, Cap'n Bill's room, but he was not there because the witch and the king had been there before her. So she made her way downstairs and questioned the servants. They said they had seen the little boy go out into the garden some time ago, but the old man with the wooden leg they had not seen at all. Therefore, Trot, not knowing what else to do, rambled through the great gardens, seeking for Button-Bright or Cap'n Bill, and not finding either of them. This part of the garden which lay before the castle was not walled in, but extended to the roadway, and the paths were open to the edge of the forest, so, after 2 hours of vain search for her friends, the little girl returned to the castle. But at the doorway, a soldier stopped her. "I live here," said Trot, "so it's all right to let me in. The king has given me a room." "Well, he has taken it back again," was the soldier's reply. "His Majesty's orders are to turn you away if you attempt to enter. I am also ordered to forbid the boy, your companion, to enter again the king's castle." "How about Cap'n Bill?" she inquired. "Why, it seems he has mysteriously disappeared," replied the soldier, shaking his head ominously. "Where has he gone to? I can't make it out. But I can assure you, he is no longer in this castle." "I'm sorry, little girl, to disappoint you." "Don't blame me. I must obey my master's orders." Now, all her life Trot had been accustomed to depend on Cap'n Bill, so when this good friend was suddenly taken from her, she felt very miserable and forlorn indeed. She was brave enough not to cry before the soldier, or even to let him see her grief and anxiety, but after she was turned away from the castle, she sought a quiet bench in the garden and, for a time, sobbed as if her heart would break. But it was Button-Bright who found her at last, just as the sun had set, and the shades of evening were falling. He also had been turned away from the king's castle when he tried to enter it, and in the park he came across Trot. "Never mind," said the boy. "We can find a place to sleep." "I want Cap'n Bill," wailed the girl. "Well, so do I," was the reply. "But we haven't got him. Where do you suppose he is, Trot? I don't suppose anything. He's gone, and that's all I know about it. Button-Bright sat on the bench beside her and thrust his hands in the pockets of his knickerbockers. Then he reflected somewhat gravely for him. Cap'n Bill isn't around here, he said, letting his eyes wander over the dim garden. So we must go somewhere else if we want to find him. Besides, it's fast getting dark, and if we want to find a place to sleep, we must get busy while we can still see where we go. He rose from the bench as he said this, and Trot also jumped up, drying her eyes on her apron. Then she walked beside him, out of the grounds of the king's castle. They did not go by the main path, but passed through an opening in the hedge, and found themselves in a small but well-worn roadway. Following this for some distance along a winding way, they came upon no house or building that would afford them refuge for the night. It became so dark that they could scarcely see their way, and finally Trot stopped and suggested that they camp under a tree. "All right," said Button-Bright. "I've often found that leaves make a good warm blanket. But look there, Trot. Isn't that a light flashing over yonder?" "It certainly is, Button-Bright. Let's go over and see if it's a house. Whoever lives there couldn't treat us worse than the king did." To reach the light they had to leave the road, so they stumbled over hillocks and brushwood, hand in hand, keeping the tiny speck of light always in sight. They were rather forlorn little waifs, outcasts in a strange country, and forsaken by their only friend and guardian, Cap'n Bill. So they were very glad when finally they reached a small cottage and, looking in through its one window, saw Pon, the gardener's boy, sitting by a fire of twigs. As Trot opened the door and walked boldly in, Pon sprang up to greet them. They told him of Cap'n Bill's disappearance and how they had been turned out of the king's castle. As they finished the story, Pon shook his head sadly. "King Krewl is plotting mischief, I fear," said he. "For today he sent for old Blinky, the wicked witch, and with my own eyes I saw her come from the castle and hobble away toward her hut. She had been with the king and Googly-Goo, and I was afraid they were going to work some enchantment on Gloria, so she would no longer love me. But perhaps the witch was only called to the castle to enchant your friend, Cap'n Bill." "Could she do that?" asked Trot, horrified by the suggestion. "I suppose so, for old Blinky can do a lot of wicked magical things." "What sort of an enchantment could she put in Cap'n Bill?" "I don't know. But he's disappeared, so I'm pretty certain she has done something dreadful to him. But don't worry. If it has happened, it can't be helped, and if it hasn't happened, we may be able to find him in the morning." With this, Pon went to the cupboard and brought food for them. Trot was far too worried to eat, but Button-Bright made a good supper from the simple food and then lay down before the fire and went to sleep. The little girl and the gardener's boy, however, sat for a long time, staring into the fire, busy with their thoughts. But at last Trot, too, became sleepy, and Pon gently covered her with the one blanket he possessed. Then he threw more wood on the fire and laid himself down before it, next to Button-Bright. Soon, all three were fast asleep. They were in a good deal of trouble, but they were young, and sleep was good to them because for a time it made them forget.